Delicious, delicious, delirious. The delirious boys are back, and there's one difference this week than there was last week. We've always been fertile, but this week we're also virile. Hello and welcome to Luca Teller's YouTube channel. That was our scrumptious intro. I'm here joined with my co-host and interlocutor supreme yet again. He goes by the name Alex Connor McLean. How are you, my good man?
I'm very good. We are back, finishing strong on a epic series. So we get into the final few chapters here, and I am more excited than ever to do justice and to complete where we are. Just fizzing with excitement and enthusiasm to give the people what they want.
Which is more us, right?
Right.
Okay, so underwater thoughts from this week, ever since I incorporated swimming into my weekly routine, was puzzlement at the idea that people struggle with the idea that the world is objectively meaningless, which isn't the same as saying that your life is meaningless, right? The world, the raw matter the physical components may not amount to anything of their own accord, but that doesn't mean that your interaction with them is equally meaningless. But that second half seems to get left out by many uninitiated men and women out there who aren't as delirious, who aren't as fertile as us. And then the other thought I had on that was just that there's a misapprehension of meaning itself. We seem to instrumentalize meaning. This was all like in one or two breaths as well. Like I went underwater and it just all came to me as like many flashes, all instantaneously, and then I had to piece it together a bit later on. But the instrumentalization of meaning and how we think something is meaningful, if it leads us somewhere, immediately it invokes a pathway and a journey and therefore a destination. And given that part of our discussion today will revolve around what that ultimate destination is, or even the ultimate beginning point is, depending on which way you woke up this morning, I guess it's strange to me that there's a baked-in innate instrumentality to the concept of meaning, where it doesn't make something meaningless if it doesn't lead somewhere, because every moment, every fiber etched in the fabric of reality seems to be completely full and complete in itself, and thereby meaningful. But it doesn't necessarily lead somewhere unless you want it to. Something can be insular and self-contained and yet at the same time be bursting at the seams. We seem to think something is bursting at the seams because it proliferates, and then it's the ripple effect. That's where the magic lies. But yeah, I guess given that an undercurrent to today's discussion will be the exact answer to people's problem, but also with infinite regress, I think maybe a simple answer is simply wearing the right tint in your glasses,
Yeah, and I think there's a fecundity to meaning where we don't have to trace out exactitudes in our field of meaning, but we can trace out the relations and how, because there's so much form that informs our worlds, but it's how we come into contact with that has real substance for us. Yeah, it's not just to try and pin something down as universal for everyone. It's to pin down for me in my personal journey, and for everyone to do this is to find how I feel about that, where that sits in my picture of the world and of things. So there's a lot on the table and there's a lot at stake when going into kind of the ultimate causes and reasons of things. And yeah, the good and bad news is that it's your job to do.
And I wonder what determines whether you realize you're up to the task or not. What are the interplay of factors that make a person realize if that is a good or bad, or if that is fluctuating, and that is the eternal nature of reality for it to fluctuate, where even someone who's up to the task is sometimes not up to the task necessarily. So these are all amusing questions. I guess I had another question on this topic for you as well. I was thinking of during the week. It's like you have three options. It's multi-choice. You have to choose one, and I don't want to hear the answer is A, B. It's not A. It's A, C, not B. I need you to pick one.
ACM, no. Gotcha.
Yeah. You have to categorize life into one of these three words and concepts. Is life most commiseration, contemplation, or celebration? And just for some context, while you mull that over, I got it from my favorite drummer to ever exist. His name's Stuart Copeland. He drummed for the Police in the late 70s and early 80s. And I find him to be a very inspiring figure and hope to speak with him in the next few months. But he talks about how the difference that broke the band up ultimately and the source of the friction between him and Sting as co-creators of the band was to do with their outlook on life and how they were constantly warring because Stuart Copeland thought of life as a celebration and the role that music held and art, music as a subset of art more widely, the role that it played in a human being's life and experience was that of viscerality and productivity and positivity, and something good happens, oh my god, I want to dance my ass off. Whereas for Sting it was closer, not commiseration, that would be an unfair categorization, but closer to maybe contemplation, where there was a richness to the depth of introspectivity that music both afforded and we afforded it as well by imbuing meaning onto it. So I found that to be a very interesting split and schism and reason for the splitting of a band, and also very understandable and justified. I know I come down on the side of Barney Stinson from How I Met Your Mother, where he says, you know what I do when I feel down, Ted? I stop feeling down and I start feeling awesome instead. And it's just as simple as that flick of a switch. So my answer is celebration. Where do you come down on it, my good man?
My answer is also celebration, and it might be for a little different reason. I think that, yeah, picking between one of them, I generally like to pick on the lighter, more joyous side. I see part of my purpose and aspiration is to show and reveal more of the beauty and joy and passion that there is in life. You know, when you do take up that choice of engaging with life more deeply. And I think, yeah, I also would go more towards the world rather than away from the world into some kind of abstraction or contemplation. And so I think there's good grounds for it to be a celebration, you know, and that's, yeah, life being a celebration, I think is quite poetic and, yeah, puts you in contact with it in such a way that it reveals and shows more to you. And yeah, that's just kind of also where my heart wants to go.
Splendid. That's so good, man. It's also, I guess it's a revealing of your character that you would say that moving towards the world is necessarily joyous and lighter, like it admits of levity rather than heaviness. I think that is testament to your profundity, my good man.
Yeah, yeah. I guess, and there's different ways of doing that, but yeah, I guess the more you kind of voyage and explore and navigate, and then still willing to come back to, yes, like contact with the world, like it's that life affirmation, right? Even for Nietzsche, someone who goes to the ends of the earth, you know, in sickness and in health, and then still wants to be a yay sayer to life. I think it is like Nietzsche was, you know, the celebrating philosopher in a sense. Even as depressed and sick as he could be, he was also the celebrating philosopher.
Absolutely. I'm even thinking of the aimlessness and wanderless nature of Jay Gatsby in The Great Gatsby, and how he's got everything but for the one thing he seeks most, which is, of course, the character of Daisy. And when he's sitting on top of his perch and he's looking out over the endless ocean and the waves crashing in on themselves and each other, he sees that green light off in the far distance, and he just thinks, like that's the watershed moment, isn't it? Like what you think in that moment where you have everything but the one thing you think you need most, the thing that makes you think, why is the grass always greener on the other side? What your reaction to that is a huge, I guess, outwardization of your development hitherto. So Jay Gatsby fails the test, but Alex does not, I guess, because Jay Gatsby is left reeling, thinking, my God, I earned it all, but at what cost? And Alex is the exact polar opposite of that, because he earned a lot and at no cost, I guess you could say. He carried
Always
his
been free. I've always found some good discounts um, in education and, yeah, a lot of things. Um, yeah, when there's It's interesting, yeah, to see Gatsby in that light, and someone who really did have to strive and kind of create a material wealth to achieve a kind of status to be worthy for this daisy. But yeah, the alternative experience of that is the one where, yeah, the wealth is non-material, the wealth is something spiritual and not of this earth.
You have a lot of daisies, don't you? You like flowers.
Yeah, easier to say. We got a lot of daisies.
We are
No,
here.
it's picking the daisies in the field and not courting them always to your mansion time and time again. Though that was the anima, right? It's not like he's chasing many daisies, but one, which is quite admirable.
Yeah, many daisies as a crowd, right? Um, yeah, we're here to talk about one of my rising all-time ranking philosophers now, Aristotle. I think I went this week reading book Lambda in his magnum opus, the Metaphysics, I would say officially, alongside maybe still the Ethics, his magnum opus and opus. He came and he climbed into my all-time rankings. He's now in the top 3, which I didn't think would happen. And I will omit the names of the others because I don't want to start a brawl. But yeah, because there seems to be a Street Fighter nature to this, where it's like, no, why is this guy better than the other? What are you talking about? My guy's better than yours, and it's just cartoonish. But yeah, I think I've grown increasingly fond of Aristotle gradually over the weeks. But then also, this was a real cornerstone chapter and book for me overall, and so I went from like to love.
There you go, the movement from desire to drive.
And thereby poeing myself. Damn it. I take it all back. Yeah.
When you realize you're a panda.
Yeah. Maybe dumplings are my fate, but I guess turning them down, are my true higher fate. So yeah.
Totally.
Yeah, this is one of his most sprawling works. I think he talks, it's divided again naturally into 2 halves. I found that, of course, Aristotle is infamously the substance-based philosopher and metaphysician. But this particular book divides itself into what in the introduction was calling it the natural philosophy, and then his mature takes on theology. And there seems to be an very clear, evident split, and both were enjoyable. But I think the theology in the second half of it was what most people are drawn to. It's also what most analysis videos and texts and essays and dissertations are written on. It's his ideas of God, the eternal, unmoved mover, prime mover, also called. And he kind of systematically works his way there methodologically. I also, fun fact, learned a new word this week from this exact book. I still don't know how to say it. It's ratiocinate, maybe ratiocinate. I didn't know what that word was, but I guess the etymology of it is from the classic ratio in Latin, which is to be to calculate or orderly. And so when you methodologically move towards an answer, leaving no one in your wake, it is to ratiocinate. Did you know that word?
Splendid. I didn't know that word, but I know that, yeah, also in Plato and Aristotle, Plato had that idea of right relation, part erotica, and like ratio religio, which is, yeah, the knowing things in their right proportion, being with them to the right degree. And it's that movement of kind of control of your own extension into things and their extension into you, and sort of being the one that can know when and where things should be like moving within you or moving without you. And yeah, and it sounds like it's the a priori of that, that you're speaking to, the kind of principle of that ordering itself.
Also released on the channel in the last few weeks is videos on Rocky and his character's relation to Dionysus, and Apollo Creed's relation to Apollo. And the reason I say Apollo, aside from plugging myself, is because I thought of the character and the god of Apollo when you mentioned Plato as, kind of a quintessence of proportion in his philosophy. And it's funny because in the first half of the series, we talked about Aristotle as the prime philosopher of fittedness. And I almost think there's Plato, proportion, Aristotle, fittedness. They both have their own earmarked versions of coextensivity and how they relate to it, which I thought was very cool. But more importantly, go watch my Rocky videos.
I think both of those are very based, both takes. Watch the video and how we characterize Plato and Aristotle. Um, yeah, I think Lambda is like what we get into here is one of the most celebrated and known part of the metaphysics. It's the kind of chapters where it's probably what we know most about Aristotle from someone who hasn't properly read him, because you do hear about, his four causes, the unmoved mover, his substance, and like those are the things that sort of get passed on to you first and foremost about Aristotle. So it's been nice to go into that, to go into the center of his theology, essentially, his views on God and his views on the basically what underpins the existence, what underpins the change, what underpins the movement of this cosmos. And for anyone that's into numerology, the most important chapters that sit within this were 6 and 7.
No one's into numerology that's watching this. Go do that on your own channel.
6, 7. All right. Yeah, this is this is the time to be an armchair philosopher, actually. This is the time to think and not act. Like, don't be out bending over, building a barn while you're doing this philosophy. Actually sit and contemplate. Philosophy is about having range. I think psychological development is about having range. And the range that we're going to here is actually getting into an armchair as comfortable as possible and just letting our physical state almost recede a little bit so that it can accentuate the speculative reason, and that we can then express that and let that go far and wide.
You're so erudite, man. Just want to give you a massive hug and squeeze all your bones and demolish you. But then I won't have a co-host. Yeah, absolutely. We want to regress and nullify our physiological state into almost not nothingness, but a stasis where we can give more due and more hue to other aspects of it. And I guess the speculative and the contemplative will take precedence today. Absolutely. Really well said. The other thing I was going to say about Aristotle as the substance-based thinker is just that in book Lambda, he differentiates himself explicitly once again from the Pythagorean brand of what you would say like idealism and the academy that he launched and ran. And then also on the other side, the twin danger, as Aristotle sees it, of the reductive materialism, maybe not so prevalent in his time, but it was, but in a different brand, more so in our time, post-industrial revolution, post-scientific revolution, and the type of everyday parlance that leads us to only assign one cause to things. So while he is armchairing himself and giving ode to speculation as being something that's supreme, he also doesn't want to make that reductive at the same time into something that's mechanical and material. He wants there to be an excitement and a poetry and a poesy to the speculation, and retain all of the glamour, reduce none of the speculation to merely the analytical or robotic. So yeah, words like contemplation especially will be used a lot today. They're not to be conflated with simply dry thinking. There's a lot of juice and wetness in the contemplation, and it's only a mere rest stop. We're taking a rest stop here so that we can descend and divulge back into the, I want to say, libidinal once we get up and out of this armchair. And yeah, anything on that?
Yeah, it's interesting that I think that approach is right. I think when you're going to question the ultimate, it's got to have that poesy to it, and the poetic nature. It's got to be artful. It's got to be wondrous, because what's at the center of this isn't a dry, calculated, logical, determined force. It's no doubt something that's creative and undetermined, and is a question of whether or not we can actually even conceive of it. But if we can conceive of it, then surely it's going to be something that is pushing us to our limits, and that we might even start to get a subtle feeling like we might be in relation to something real. Surely we have a sense of what's real. We've had to always be going by that in evolutionary history. And so maybe now we can apply it through our reason to rest in what's most real. The mind will keep searching and wondering if it doesn't feel like it has reached a a good armchair to rest in. And the alternative to that is, the analytic, the robotic. And for me, it felt like part of our last episode was really kind of moving through that and bringing to question Aristotle's kind of language of metaphysics and the thing that underpins reference itself, the law of non-contradiction. And we were looking at whether that has the kind of the spirit or the wherewithal to flex and bend and extend into different areas, if it could be a wellspring to give us and reveal to us lots more in a wide range of domains, or whether it was something that was quite confined and like strictly logical and only applied to a certain set. And there was something in that dialogue that was coming through to me that I was trying to express. And I did some digging to find a quote from an unpublished manuscript, which I think does capture it. So I quote, "And therefore the lines of logic are not merely categorical, but musical. They are a song. They are not held by the lines of the music sheet, but the very notes that leap off the page and become the symphonic character of the sequence. So too must philosophy leap off the page and break into symphony composed of living, breathing spirit." That's a quote from a manuscript that's titled "Openings to a New Kind of Knowledge." I'm currently the one authoring that, and so you heard it here first.
What a reveal. Well, that's perfect, because I thought that I was, cycling through the usual suspects in my mind of who could have written that, who could have written that. What I forgot is the prime unmoved mover is Alex. So, yeah, I knew it sounded familiar. I've interacted with this in my head many times, but I've also interacted with you in real life many times. So that's why it sounded familiar. Now, bravo, man. Yeah, you want to have best of both worlds. It sounds like a nice delineation of the A-B answer we hearken to many times, where the coherency and the cogency, from where does it emerge? It emerges from the breathing, vibrating life form of each individual note and the relation they hold symphonically with one another. And the lines are there, but the lines are there to be broken, much like how the best protagonist, perhaps in the history of cinema, Harry Potter, understands all too well. You want to
The
follow,
constant rule breakers, the heroes are constant rule breakers, right? And
but
it's like,
only
that's
but only when the rule being asked to be followed transgresses on the spirit in which it was intended.
yes. And that's why it's almost how you have this A-B-ness to answers, because it's a little bit of the divine principle is that which has the capacity to break a rule, or is showing up in this way, but really is from a new and transformed state. And so the way that it presents us here and now is going to look different. It's going to look acategorical. It's going to look outside of the system in some way. And that's because it has the ability to transcend and move and go up and outside of the system, to break rules, to know when, there's a rule which is just analytic and robotic, when it can actually breathe life into that by going beyond. But even so, to what you're saying about how we don't just want to kind of be in that absolutely and inflate it such that we idolize this broken rule. No, we do want a rule that's put together, but we want it such that it isn't confound and delimited by the same strictures that other sets and schemas are.
Yes, and to not be seduced by the lascivious nature that is rule breaking per se, but to act from our time, counter to our time, but then thereby acting on our time, as Deleuze said, to paraphrase what he said. Yeah, it's not just willy-nilly this, it's not willy-nilly that. It's a golden mean of sorts that is transcendent. And then also, I found a resparking of the superposition idea we spoke about, maybe in the middle of this whole series on Aristotle. Just put simply, like a dual existence, each with equal weight and reality, of different centers of force, and each having a understandable, understated, but real, very real reality unto themselves. Because if I was to write a treatise, and I have some unpublished manuscript notes on this myself for the book coming out next year, it would be called adverbs, adverbs, adverbs. Like, it's all about the way in which something was intended. And I would just go like into a hyper perspectivism and find nodes in reality and understand the manner in which the disjunction is more telling and revelatory than the conjunction in the relationship. And how that relates to Aristotle here is I found him saying, and I quote, I can't remember which lambda this is from, but one of the earlier ones, he says, can be said universally, cannot be said unqualifiedly. When his answer is yes, this way or that way, that really just invokes what I love the most in English language, which is adverb, which I think is so underrated as a determinant of reality.
Love it. Love it. Yeah. Favorite word class, the adverb, hearing it here live on the pod. I myself would be disjunctions as my favorite. No, I'm kidding. I like what you're bringing there, because the adverb sits in that interesting place of being a, determination of a verb. So you're not only getting now to like, okay, how do we qualify a noun? But no, you're saying what is the kind of relation between something, like the movement that, a noun, a person walking, like how they're walking, like the qualities of that movement, the verb, the doing, is what's quite interesting. And so I think it's well placed to pick up on that and say that that class of thing is actually, like, as we talked about, how you can come to construct new substance and like non-accidental being by going into potential, by going into things that aren't determinate in the substance itself, in the entity itself, but how the entity is expressed and moving finds new self-determination.
Totally. And I'm even thinking of the album cover that everyone listening or watching will know of, The Dark Side of the Moon and the Prism from Pink Floyd, 1970 something, and how there's a rainbow of colors going in, and each one is equally valid as a streak, but I think a thin stream of light coming out, and it's not in and out that way. It's a dual in and out that way. So I'm even thinking of one of the authors I never really resonated with, but Charles Dickens, and his writing style is highly descriptive. When the kind of contra existential greats like Tolstoy and Dostoevsky and even Bulgakov, where they would describe the feeling state and the inner movements of a character as they enter the room, and that would color heavily the objects that they see, and whatever's foregrounded is what will be spoken about. Whereas Charles Dickens will take the opposite approach of, here is every last item in the room that you need to know about, dear reader, and from here build the blocks up. So taking that opposite approach is something that's really jarring and a bit difficult to sludge through when you're reading, because you're thinking, this guy walked into a room, why is he describing like the cockroach crawling in the corner of the room if it's not pertinent to the story? But he's a different form of world building, I suppose.
Yeah. Yeah, Aristotle's world building it in one way, and he's absolutizing it, because he's like doing the whole didactic. We're stripping this back. We don't need this. He's trying to analyze and incorporate everything. He's trying to extend his spirit out into everywhere, and then bring it back to his four causes and his principles and causes, to help find the truth of the universe. But it's interesting to observe how there are different kind of world buildings that we can do. And we've been exploring in this how there's a dialectical world building, there's a process metaphysical world building, and everything in between, right? Even that the infusion of technology in this, or the infusion of human spirit and kind of will to power as different kinds that we can ladder up to a full ontological picture. And the quote that you shared from last time, which talked about how philosophy must extend its vocabulary uniquely to science and art, and that is just the place of it, that it houses a wealth of understanding. It opens us up to a new kind of knowledge, and that is what extends. But it's really useful here to add some relativity to that picture, to say that although we've world builded, we've tunnel vision world builded for 2,000 years in the West, like so has the East. So, and there's been many offshoots and branches, and so it's really unfolding into this big tree. And it's not to say, okay, we can pick this branch and like this one offshoot, and that's the picture, because it houses within this great tree. And it's hard to try and specify the whole of the tree in one philosophy. It's near impossible. So we have to take it as a whole, and we have to pick our branch, trust it, and see ourselves as part of it, as a much greater tree, without losing the truth of what we have, but without overextending it and fudging the ones before us or the ones around us, just because we don't have the flexibility to move between.
Yeah, can we distill essences from different branches, abstract out commonalities without diluting the underlying essence of any one respective branch? Is the name of the game in some sense of philosophy, where we're trying to find more and more meta patterns and try and put worth and elevation on them without losing any of the unmeta. And that's a very hard task, and something that everyone has failed at to some degree and everyone has succeeded at to some degree.
And I guess like part of it, and when you bring in that distinction of how can we go meta as a branch, might be to go to the trunk, to try and find, because when you're going to the trunk, you don't have the leaves, so you can't see the things that's touching the light in a sense, but you can see the function of the light moving to the roots of the soil, and the soil and the roots moving, minerals and water up to the branches. So you can see the bidirectionality. There's a tree, and you can get meta in some way. And I think that there is a real move. Like, I want to say the meta is real, to make the move of, okay, let me actually look for and discern the patterning here. I think that's possible. I think that's what the practice of philosophy is. But to also just know its place and know that there's so many other places around too. Yeah. Well, do you have a delicious quote for us today, and then I can take us to the recapper?
I certainly do, but just before that, to acknowledge what you said, I said earlier that this is also Aristotle moving from natural philosophy to theology. A reframing of that would be him moving from the nature of substance to causation. And when I think of our focus and deliberation we'll do today on causation, that seems more like a move towards the trunk of the tree and the machinations of reality, as opposed, and not, I'm saying that neutrally, not like a Machiavellian machination, but yes, more about the inner working source code nature of reality. And this is something that I've found to be a delightful surprise, because it felt like this entire book was like the song "I Want to Be Adored" by the Stone Roses, which is notoriously a 4-minute build up to nothing, and then the song ends. But luckily, in the last 4 books of this book, Aristotle comes in with his saving grace and he crescendos to something, and then we see the drop, and now we're in the drop. And so I'm very, very happy about that. I do have a quote as well. Okay, so this is to do with my favorite word in the English language, which is monstrous. And it's an old maxim that Nietzsche uses to disdain and deride Socrates in a chapter entitled "The Problem of Socrates" in Twilight of Idols, where he says "monstrum in frente, monstrum in animo," which is Latin for monstrous by appearance, monstrous by spirit, or monstrous in appearance and in spirit. And we're gonna start on that. And then also I found out there's another sort of collection of fragments work by Diogenes expressing similar disdain for Socrates, called Lives of the Eminent Philosophers, which I'm also intending on reading sometime soon. I didn't even know it existed. But yes, the quote of today will be basically a play on the idea that what is monstrous will be so regardless of the case. And so exact polar opposite of what we just said about giving weight to nuance. Something that is true is a broad sweeping stroke true, regardless of case, regardless of culture, regardless of time.
I love it. Yes, Socrates with the monstrous face, the monstrous head on his shoulders.
Let's do the recap, my man.
Well, today's recapper. So 2 episodes ago in Iota, we looked at the philosophical grounds of knowledge itself. We looked at unity and the common senses of unity, what we can know and learn about the one, such that we can conceive of things as one, they can be intelligible to us. And in episode 17, you could say something like, which was book Kappa. Kappa was the greatest post hoc recap that contained the most cap front to back, and we lapped it up, but we're also left wondering at the fact if Aristotle really clapped or not. But one thing that did clap was our recap. And enough rhymes. The recap of our episode last time was golden, was so good. There were so many threads, so many branching threads that got out all the way to the sunlight, some really like fleshed out branches. And there was, to my reading, just a series of books that we had spawned in there, a series of books that are waiting to be read that would be at the, you know, at the vanguard. They would be at the leading edge of different fields of collision, fields of collision, not just like honed in on one specific subject, but actually honing in on two different areas and then seeing their cross connection. Like in the start of the series, like how we were thinking about this as like philosophy as, finding these new connections between different disparate fields and actually revealing the connection to show something more about them. And so we
Adjacent
started.
possibilities.
Yes, yes. And now the word that we have for it, the language that takes is adjacent possibilities. And we're not even connecting different ideas, but connecting different potentials now. Yeah.
And those potentials are constrained, and those constraints are beautiful, and we will find out today why.
Exciting stuff here on the channel. So the first point that we were sort of discussing and almost in this recap flow was the difference between like when the content is present versus when the flow of the author is present. And we noticed that Aristotle was seeming to flow more in the recent chapter, whereas there were ones before that he was a bit more content heavy. And in the chapter, we were kind of looking at how there was almost that separation between when Aristotle is dealing with discrete things, which is in metaphysics, and then in non-discrete and continuous things, which is in the physics. And that actually in the last book in Kappa, they were kind of both there, and the first 6 being more in the direction of the physics and the second 5 in the direction of metaphysics. And yeah, as I said, there was a lot of books that were kind of conceived in the space of about 20 minutes. And so I wrote out what their titles would be. This is my go at what some of these book titles are. Firstly, Adjacent Possibles, how we suspend the real to access the truth of fantasy. Secondly, The Potency of Potential, the pathway to the essential through non-essentiality. Thirdly, Zeroing in and zeroing out, the movement that reveals the nature of things. Fourthly, Bidirectional metaphysics, attentional currency and its reversal.
Why, when you say it in that timbre of voice, does it sound like these books already exist?
I know that's what's funny. I'm like, oh shit, that would be a sound read. Um, Here's another one. The difficult conception of zero, experiencing non-experience. Musical unity and fragmentation, intentional manipulation of the sense one from tool. Jazz and co-realization, from pain to miracle. And finally, philosophy is physiology, muscle memory, and the one. By the way, guys, no chat GPT was used. I watched that many videos I read a lot of books. I know how to write a title. It might sound like chat GPT, but that was from the source.
To reinstate for people that might have cut out at the most opportune moment, none of these books exist. These are books that should exist, maybe perhaps will exist, perhaps already do exist, but no one's read them yet.
I think you're going to write the one on tool. You've got all the ideas there. Yeah, and in the rest of this episode, we were playing around with how Aristotle has intentionally done a bit of a recap on what he's talked about so far. So there was in some ways where it was spending more time with this new synthesis that Aristotle was giving, but for us as well, finding what's new in it from our leap in time. We covered this first, months ago. Now to cover and recap on some of the same topics were interesting and led to some discussion around whether Aristotle had gone to show something new and how. And so I think we other ideas came up like bioelectricity and the consonances for understanding our biology and physiology, and then being able to have adaptations to that. So a real a real speaking together from the transgenders and the transhumanists, all aspiring to be trans. uh, there was also like what came up was the unique place of physiology to analyze its own function and to articulate its very essence. And that's, kind of what pulls on our heartstrings, is what was said, how philosophy does have the ability to almost operate from this basis of making no assumptions when every other subject has to make assumptions to predicate itself. Philosophy can and should and does go in and question those assumptions, to reveal more of its truth.
Dude, you know what pisses me off very quickly? Philosophy is the only one that has the good sense to backtrack and do the one step back, two steps forward. And yeah, admittedly, albeit get it wrong a lot of times, and the back step you did actually literally just made you go backwards in life. But it's the only one that has the lack of inflation in the ego that's embedded in its core to actually do the self-questioning. And no other science admits of this level of backtracking like permitted in the field itself. And yet philosophy also gets it wrong. But it's almost like we're the ones, man. We're the ones actually doing what needs to be done, and then everyone else is breathing as a result of it. But we're where it begins, we're where it ends. We're kind of like the sun in the first scene of The Lion King, where people in Pride Rock don't understand the amount of emittance that that comes out of the sun and how much of life is ordered by just the sun existing. That's what we philosophers are.
And yeah, that sun existing is a little bit like Aristotle's senses of unity, how intelligibility, like what must the conditions of reality be like such that intelligibility is possible, such that we can understand things. And we're operating very much from that basic level. I think as well, yeah, what differentiates philosophy, to put into a succinct way what I was hearing from you, is what differentiates philosophy is its relation to its epistemic potency, how actually in its own epistemology, its own theory of knowledge, there's a rich potential where it can keep going back into that. It doesn't have to like establish laws like physics and then you proceed from there. It doesn't have to establish Darwinian evolution laws and then bootstrap from there. It can keep going back to the basics. It can keep going back to what we are bootstrapping from and analyze that and kind of recalibrate and recontextualize itself with new learnings, with new forms of knowledge. Philosophy is best placed to look at and really understand the real impacts that something like this AI revolution is going to have. Part of my thoughts on that have been philosophical and has been like deeply revealing to me, in understanding this. And it hasn't been through understanding what the technological capabilities are. It's understanding what they mean for us and what that's going to do to our Western psyche, how that's going to bring us more concentrated to the word, to the logos, to the spoken and written word, more related to the imaginal spaces where we can have constructed intelligence and constructed fields of visions, and that there's a computational reality underpinning that, which we as humans, our psyche is very congealient with. We are recreating a kind of psyche built on computation, and it unlocks real power. And then when we can create little humanoid agents, as we call them, then we have created a world which we can create more of ourselves to operate in. And that's why it gives us tremendous flexibility, capability, intelligence, and why a lot of jobs are going, because the jobs that were being done were able to be done by simulated intelligence. And so it's a great shit test. And yeah, it also has real profound implications for today's world and for making sense of it. And it's something like philosophy which can return to those principles and understand and ask the question. And so to finish on the recap, we returned to and spent a good amount of time with Aristotle's law of non-contradiction, which was one of the more fascinating parts of Kappa. And it was, almost refreshing to see Aristotle returning to an idea, and not, question, having to redo it like Wittgenstein, or these philosophers where you have a distinct difference between the early and the late. Even Nietzsche, kind of goes back on his work. But Aristotle was perhaps at a mature point of his writing where when he took the pen to paper in metaphysics. He knew what he wanted to say, and he says it. And it's not like there's no flexibility within Aristotle, as we'll see in this chapter. When he first points to the unmoved mover, he first kind of wants to say there's an unmoved mover for each of the celestial spheres, for each of the stars that move. Each of them has an unmoved mover. And then later on, he goes, okay, but also there must only be one, because they share the same basically structure or essence. And so it's not like he doesn't have that. So he does have it. And so it was good to see that he wanted to stay connected to the law of non-contradiction, and that was just a firm basis for his knowledge. The question or the analogy that I would put here to kind of understand what our discussion, or from my perspective, what our discussion was revolving around, and I'd be interested to hear your perspective as well, Luca, was, should Aristotle get credit for being literally true, or does he kind of shackle himself to the cell block of logic? So has he created a wellspring? Has he found the key to fling open the doors and stroll in Apollo's court? Or and found a principle of non-contradiction that governs many levels of intelligibility? Or has he boxed himself in, and because of the emphasis he places on this law-like, non-contradictory, always A or B, always determinate answer, does that keep him contained within that realm? And what we need today is someone who can go to all these different realms. So I feel like that sort of was at the center of what we were discussing, and we didn't land on it too firmly either way, but it was nice to pass the ideas back and forth. And it felt like, for me, I'll talk to for me, and then I'll allow you to address your part as well, and then I'm kind of done with the idea here. But it sort of felt like what we need in a metaphysical principle is something that can go up and down the levels of intelligibility, something that can go cosmic, and something that can come right into the here and now. And it's a little bit like ethics. Ethics is something that we can take cosmic and then can bring down, and it exists within all these levels. And I was wondering if the law of non-contradiction could do that, or whether Aristotle had conceived of it in a quite a kind of well-defined propositional manner, and that was its weakness. I know that's also its definite strength, but I was wondering if there was a weakness there which stopped it from being something that we could take into, the extremes, into physics of today, and lots of the mysterious qualities to life that we know.
That was very concise, yet had all the poetry we needed and didn't lose an iota of art. And so that was very symphonic to listen to, yet was terse. So bravo to you, my man. Well done. We said earlier that today's objective will be one of speculation, but to kind of strap us into the armchair deliberately, and then perhaps into the right armchair, and momentarily only, for the sake of the speculation. And we're not going to lose any of the magic and bewitchment that arises in the speculation, because we're going to be perfectly poised and ready for it. To answer your question more properly, though, I think what really impressed me about Aristotle in this entire second half of the Metaphysics was his courage, his unabashedness to simply posit. And I think he would be well aware of the tension that you are bringing up, and very, very reasonably so. It is its definite strength as well as its weakness that he's providing parameters. And does that limit us from traversing the orders of intelligibility that exist existentially, and does it leave out too much? And we talked about the necessary extrication of the fringe and anomalous cases of the law of non-contradiction, and for it to hold, it has to necessarily not hold in certain cases, and those cases are the more wet and appealing and amorous ones, even, I want to say, in the sense of eros. Like, they're genuinely more erotic, and they are the object of our pull and push more ardently. And isn't that where the true adjacent possibilities emerge from? And isn't that the object of philosophy? But the answer to all of that is a strong no. No, I was just going to say, I was really impressed by Aristotle in this whole thing. I also want to read out a quote from the first page of Beyond Good and Evil that I've dictated before. Nietzsche says, "It seems that in order to inscribe themselves upon the heart of humanity with everlasting claims, all great things first have to wander about the earth as enormous and awe-inspiring caricatures." And Aristotle is almost not doing the caricature thing. He's telling us, here's the thing. Yeah, it's subject to future refinement through posterity and trial and tribulation. But for now, this isn't even a caricature. This is the real thing. And yeah, it might get updated, it might get downgraded, whatever. But I think there's just a soulful bravery and a valor to his spirit in these books. And so when he posits something like the law of non-contradiction, this is the one time I make the exception of not worrying about the character of the man postulating, and I'm more just impressed by mere fact of the postulation. So hopefully somewhere in there there's an answer, but I don't think that it's too much of a weakness that there are clear cases where the law of non-contradiction doesn't hold, because I think it's that's only apparently the case. I think if I'm being very like I'm not lying ordinarily, but if I'm being ultimately truthful, I think there's no cases where the non-contradiction law doesn't hold, because it's by mere fact of our lack of knowledge, partiality, cognitive and neurological biases that we simply don't see it in that position. But
And
that was
you'd probably say as well that the law contradiction always holds because we're not trying to push it and flex it and extend it into areas which it doesn't want to go, but that, you know, at its core it does hold. And there's not something there's not something that can exist in contradiction in the way that the law of non-contradiction says that it can't.
the one thing I think Aristotle could have improved upon is the wording. I think it's rather wearisome to say that, because it just irks the modern democratic instinct of the modern soul. Like, oh, really? Like, are you telling me there's no cases where contradiction holds? It's just like the terminology could have been better, you know?
And I think, yeah, it definitely irks the modern soul, but even like the meta-modern soul, different kind of irk, but still feeling like, okay, we shouldn't even strive for this one ultimate principle, but we should strive for a generative principle that can, you know, be really uh, that we can really vibe with. You know, it's about vibes.
Yeah, yeah, and that's what I'm saying. Like, even if the law of non-contradiction has generative principles, it doesn't seem as such when you paint it in that light. And the examples we get ordinarily, even if you watch a 5-minute YouTube video, it'll tell you about how a cat can't be blue and also not blue, and you think, yeah, but is that really so? Is that really so fringe? Is that really so fertile in the cases that matter? But yeah, I mean, that's what makes us seem that it doesn't have an innate generation capacity in it. But yeah.
Yeah,
We can get
great.
on to Lambda 1 now. Did you want to start or should I?
Yep, I can kick us off.
All right.
Yeah, Lambda 1, it's in some like the sense that Lambda has is it's a bit of a, again, almost overview, a crash course of all of philosophy up to this point. It's really compact and dense and to the point to Aristotle. So there's a lot of great moments and pieces in it, but I think for sake of this series, they are parts that we have indwelt. And so to extract from Lambda 1, what I thought was the greatest, most essential thing to know for our listeners was a quote which I'll read out and then kind of form the basis of some of this discussion. It's a little bit lengthy, but I think it's condensing the whole of the chapter into one. So I'll read it. The subject of our inquiry is substance, for the principles and the causes we are seeking are those of substance. For if the universe is of the nature of a whole, substance is its first part. And then I quote at a later stage, there are three kinds of substance, one that is sensible, perceptible, and perishable, of which we must grasp the elements, whether one or many, and whether that is immovable, perishable, perceptible, and imperishable. And this certain thinkers assert to be capable of existing apart. The former two kinds of substance are the subjects of physics, for they imply movement, but the third kind belongs to another science, logic, mathematics. if there is no principle common to it and the other kinds immune to any change of any kind. And so it's almost like Aristotle is, yeah, kind of typologizing three kinds of substance. So he's taken what he has gone great lengths to develop and define, and now kind of showing how there's almost these different classes and categories of them, where, yeah, like one is sensible and one is like non-sensible, so unable to be perceived by the senses. And yeah, immune to change of any kind. Like, it's the sciences that can get us to understand the perceptible and perishable and the perceptible and imperishable. But there is some that the sciences can't get us to, and it's more like logic and mathematics, which gets us all the way. And I feel like, yeah, when you think about, okay, what's a non-perishable substance? You could think of like one of the laws of physics as a non-perishable substance. It's something that governs and orders and has unique character, and is, for Aristotle, kind of, the law of gravity, always instantiated within things, but it itself doesn't exist abstractly. It only exists concretely. And so it has that substance to it. But yeah, I thought it was interesting how Aristotle was starting to kind of group and class. It's almost like he's still playing around with this idea of substance, but yeah, it does mark a discernible development in his ideas around substance.
Yeah, I think that's the perfect quote. Despite the length, it just perfectly encapsulates much of Lambda 1. I was looking a bit more into the categorical imperative this past entire month, actually, and I felt a warmth towards it that I didn't feel in the past. And I was wondering about the psychological and philosophical change and constitution in my psyche that led to me warming up to it. And a conclusion I came to was that I am more discerning of map and territory now than I have ever been before. And I think when Aristotle typologizes the way he has, he's very bravely putting something forth. And it's impressive because he's giving us three distinct categories. He's saying perceptible, perishable, perceptible, imperishable, and then the third one. And you, as long as you can distinguish that this is firmly a map that's highly useful, but to be relinquished at perhaps the most opportune moment, you can actually go to town with it. I really liked his well, I had a problem. I love the perspicuity of the whole chapter, but I really had a problem with almost his first presumption from the get-go, where he says, because assuming the universe is a kind of whole, substance would have to be its primary constituent. Yeah, okay, but is the universe a whole? Like, what are the atmospheric layers at which we stop and say, this is the universe, condensed, done, finished, finito? Like, is it this layer of the atmosphere? Is it well beyond the Earth? Because obviously the universe, even for the ancient Greeks, was well beyond the planet, despite the nature of the centric model we operated in. So where do you stop? And if the universe is infinite, then how is it a whole? Because then you have run into the problem of infinity. So it felt fraught with error from the get-go. But if you just accept that, like, that's the presumption, then everything flows rather elegantly from there.
Yeah. And I think that's a little bit of, yeah, some of the way that these pre-modern philosophers and, philosophers of all age, modern philosophers, do fall short in some ways. How we treat them has to be different. We're not looking at them to be a theory of everything where everything must hold all the time, but we can look to the structure of their thought and where they were wanting to go, and yeah, look if we can help them to say something that they're not. So to kind of almost give some charity when needed, or to, yeah, say, actually, no, this was discernibly wrong. But as you're saying, it does make you have to kind of loosen the grip you have on them, which is, in a one sense, quite good. If you're reading like the latest theory of someone today, you have to really like do the work to try and understand if there's truth value or not. But if you're reading someone from much time ago, you're okay for them to make a mistake, and you're like, okay, you say, no, like, I'll still follow, I'm still reading along. I know you're wrong here. I know we can update you in this way, but I'm still open to really hearing what you're saying. So
Yes,
there's
and
a kind
yes,
of,
And there's a putting forth of snapshots of reality, and we're more forgiving the further back in history we go because of that Deleuzian sentiment of we don't read Kant for what Kant had to say, but for what Kant can be made to do for us. And there's an deliberately, positively appropriative nature to studying philosophers like Aristotle, especially, where there's just so much substance, pun unintended, of his ideas and so much potency, like just dying to come out when he typologizes and taxonomizes as such. And you just think, I could have a field day with this if only I could forgive one or two elements, you know?
Yeah, yeah. So it's nice, and it's almost an advantage of reading the ancient philosophers is that if someone goes, "Oh, but you know that like this is wrong about them," you're like, "Yeah, so what?" Like, and
The
you
power
can
move, eh?
push on with it. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And like the entirety of book Lambda, like it gets progressively untoward, like in a sense, like there's just a like comical nature. I was actually thinking of Stanley Kubrick. Have you seen Space Odyssey?
I don't think so.
But like Kubrick's
Oh.
general nature, and comes to the fore most in his quintessential work, 2001: A Space Odyssey, is him kind of just indulgently being artistical and the wandering expeditions of someone who just does not care, and he's going to make the film how he wants to make it because he's been granted the budget. So it's like the capitalism part is covered. Now he doesn't care if anyone watches it. He got his payday, and it's almost more artistic that way, you know. And
And that's the movie where the first 2 minutes is just like there's like shit all happening, and everyone's like so excited. The movie starts, and then isn't it like there's this real like extended shot of like nothing happening, and we're all like what? And it's almost that
yes,
moment where he just his own art takes the viewers and just like swats anything out of their mind of what they were expecting, and then can start to deliver what
it
he wanted to.
it's so heterodox, and it's like genuinely so, like not the kind where you're trying to be edgy but you're like failing the edge lord game, because he's just an artist feeling into himself finally, is how I interpreted it. And even the last like 20 minutes is just an explosion of color in the sky, and like it's almost like a firework array of display that is just going nowhere. And he's deliberate. It's also queer cinema in the sense that he's playing with traditional senses of narrative. And I felt a level of, I don't know if there's a word, farcicality in Aristotle here, where he's just feeling into himself. And this is about as lucid as he'll be, Lambda 1, that is. And from here, he gets progressively more unstructured and allows himself that indulgence. So we'll get into that. But yeah, on Lambda 1, though, I think the separability thing is very, very important. He says the reason that substance is the or a primary constituent of, no, the primary constituent of the world in its finitude, if it can be defined as a finite thing, is because of separability. There are aspects that are aspects and relational, not ontologically significant, for example, quantity, quality, etc., that need something to be a quantity or quality of, where a substance is immune to that and fundamentally separable. You can see one substance from another. You can't see one redness from another, for example.
And I think it's a great way to, yeah, almost understanding Aristotle's constant sort of reminding of that is the role of substance, and he qualifies certain things as substance and other things not, depending on whether they can differentiate from one another. We remember from a few episodes ago where we were talking about how kind of a prime matter or a base matter, if we took something and stripped all of its properties and qualities off, we would just have this kind of composite kind of matter. He
Mm.
said that that couldn't be substance because it's non-differentiable. And I think he's almost getting us to this place. And what we're seeing there is a development of Greek consciousness. Because before him, you had all of these people that were kind of essential, like material monists was the way that Aristotle would call them. But it's true that there were a lot of them that did hail back to a single substance to say that it was, water was the origin of all things, or fire. And you even have dualists who are saying like it's love and hate that move all things, but always regressing to one. And Aristotle, I think, is wanting to give us a language that shows many of the differentia, many of the, you know, the combinatorial explosion doesn't come from a one. It comes from an interaction between many different yet substantial components. And so I think you're just seeing Aristotle moving consciousness forward by asserting that.
That was excellent, and I fully agree. I think he showcases this also with his insistence on the primacy of things like genera.
Yeah,
Um,
and there was
yeah,
another quote that I wanted to pull out, and this is kind of segueing into Lambda too. So feel free to just let this span a flowing dialogue between chapters now. And I quote, "The causes and the principles then are three, two being the pair of contraries, of which one is definition and form, and the other is privation, and the third being the matter." So again, Aristotle finding another triple, another trinity to explain the principles and causes, because he's saying that, yeah, you can't just have this universal principles and causes which applies to everything, but they should be understood within these specific domains. We know that Aristotle says that principles and causes don't extend to accidental being, because of its randomness, because it is not substantially, like, recurringly the same. So you couldn't apply principles and causes which are the same to things which are in constant flux. He doesn't want to go there, and so in a different way, in a different means of differentiating and bringing a level of resolution to his principles and causes, he wants to, yeah, show how some of them exist in a very, like, attached to um, definition and form. The other one, like, privation from that when it's lacking, and the third being matter. So although we have this set of, like, four principles and causes which are universal, the way that they show up, it's almost like the causes are universal, but the principles of how they apply are uniquely placed to these classes of substance that he's also categorizing.
yeah, I think this is a display of his famous temperance, right? There's a field and there is a array of topics that are permitted within the field, and the degree of precision is decided by some sort of innate form in the field. I was hearing a lot of that with I'm forgetting the three. It's privation, matter. What was the other one? Sorry, form.
Privation, matter, and form or definition.
Yeah, totally. So there are cases where only this can be afforded, and so we'll leave it at that, and kind of like very sanely and rationally so. So yeah, I enjoyed that. I didn't have too much to say on Lambda too, otherwise.
Yeah. And I thought as well it was kind of interesting how he's alluding to giving a set of principles and causes to the privation of something. And we saw earlier as well how, yeah, for Aristotle, something like evil is, or yeah, evil is. And I know you don't really want to extend that language there because they didn't have that sort of religious substrate, but maybe the good and then what is opposed to the good. There's no, like, force.
Depletion.
There's no dualism there. It is like it is the extension or the good of the good, or its absence, but it's not this, like, other that is, like, in a cosmic entanglement with the good. It's just the good is the source, and removing yourself from the source is creating this disorder
Yes.
and chaos.
The thing that's not good is simply the momentary perversion, and the thing that is not good is the depleted state that is dying and vying for the process of restoration to replenish it anew, essentially, right? It's just things that are good or not there at the moment, not quite at the moment, and privation is kind of like by dint of moment and time. So it's not a case of like this is a legitimate ontological category. Like, wow, we have to worry about things that are impoverished.
Yeah, and it's also interesting, like, because for on the privations point, he would see that as, like, the difference of opposites. So something being hot, being very deprived, is turns into something that's cold. So the kind of the continuums that things exist on, I guess, like, his thing of privations is saying, yeah, the continuum that being exists on is, the good or the intelligible, and privation from that takes you to dissolution and non-intelligibility. But then on the smaller scale, it is just from, like, hot to cold or loud to quiet, like these kind of poles that we have. And so he's, yeah, just I guess giving some terms to what we know are in cognition as opposites and dualisms,
Yeah,
polars.
I think further testament of this is what he says. I'll quote from the next part. This is to do with the gripe he famously has with the transcendental nature of Plato's forms. as distinct from his version of the forms. He says, if there is in fact any separable existence of non-composites, then it occurs in the case of natural things. So Plato was not wrong to make his forms coextensive with natural existence, if indeed there are forms. But that does not mean that he should have allowed such forms as fire, flesh, and head, for these are all material, and it is the last that is the material of what is most clearly a substance. So talking about head, he says that's what's material, and what is material of what is most clearly a substance. So the body is the substance, the head is the material or the removable. We talked about essentiality as removability or something episodes ago, and I really love that. And maybe that'll be the fundamental takeaway from this entire series for me, because it changed my life, Alex. But here, Aristotle, wow, that's telling. I almost confused you two. Yeah, Aristotle talks about how the forms make sense for things like trees and horses and people, because they all have, and this is the distinguishing factor, because all of those things have their own principle of development. So when he says that a head is a subset of a body, you think, interesting, why not the other way? Why not this? Why not that? Especially our, postmodern mind just works that way of, first, if in doubt, deconstruct, right? And so he's kind of saying, but things like fire and flesh don't make sense, because the main factor here is whether something has a principle of development, not an internal unity, because clearly a head, as distinct from the body, has its own internal unity. It's classed as its own thing, and there's clearly head and non-head and not head, but it doesn't have a principle active of continuous development. And so he says, but fire and flesh don't make sense because they're component parts, they're bits and bobs, essentially. They're materials of a substance. Things like flesh exist similar to how a head exists on a body. Flesh exists as part of an organism. So we would not say that flesh is, a substance. You would in some cases, but like when we're speaking grandiosely and metaphysically, you wouldn't say flesh is one of the core constituents of reality as we experience it.
There's something that really pricked my interest in what you said, that you said for yourself was life-changing, and I'd be curious to hear more about that and how you've kind of reflected on it post hoc, like what it's done for your cognition day to day, when talking about, that idea of the removability of the essential. Would you mind giving an overview of that idea and like how that has impacted you in that way?
Yeah, so something we spoke about many episodes ago was the idea of removability as essentiality, and how a core component of something is the fact that it is extricable from the thing itself. And in this case, I guess you could attune that to the idea of the head as being removable. No, the flesh as being something that's analogous of and subsidiary to the body of an organism, and how the flesh is actually fundamentally, foundationally essential to the organism because it's removable from it, theoretically. Perhaps not like you would become a corpse if someone removed your flesh, but the principle holds still in theory, that we were using the idea of a king and his crown, and how he is most a king because he's wearing a crown, but the crown is still removable. And I think coalesced so many different thought streams for me when we happened upon that, because it was very emergent. We weren't trying to, by means of a means, come to that answer at the end of the equal sign from the start of the equation, and we just really happened upon it on what felt like very much a quest. And so, I think the principle of extricability is just so profound, and the way that it shaped and determined my day-to-day life and perception and cognition is because we associate, for whatever reason, we instinctively associate removability with a temporal scale. For example, determination of a friendship. We think, okay, so this person was in my life but isn't anymore. And then, okay, so that's one thing, hold that. And then what I said in the intro of this discussion was moments as we experience them are essentially insular and self-contained and bursting with meaning in themselves, because you remove instrumental. So the two core ideas here would be removability and instrumentality. When you remove instrumentality from a moment, it ceases to be something that's a pathway to in a grander destination. And so what you're left with is a complete moment, a complete moment, a complete moment. And I'm viewing this purely temporally for the sake of the example. And when every moment is complete unto itself and warmly insular, you don't feel the need for this moment to be sad because a previous moment was a certain way and should have led to you being here and there. And there's a whole heap of repercussions and implications that just dwindle away, and you're left with simply the present if you can fully understand, grasp, and embody the principle of removability. I think there's a bit of movement there in terms of, am I, equivocating words, but the way that it came into my life was to do with realizing that the crown can be removed if you're truly the king, which is to state the obvious, but at any given moment to be the king, you must have the crown. So there's like a like a transcendence of opposites element there as well. So hopefully in there somewhere there's an answer.
Yeah, that just brought back a whole flood of some of the juice of this. And I think it was back in episode Epsilon where we talked about it. Just a quick search of my notes. And what I had there was, yeah, like it also involved that notion of identity. And so for a king to be a king, for a king to assume an identity that isn't like a tyrant, was his relation to his crown is one that is removable. So there are some identities in which what is essential about their identity is that they can negate or remove what is essential about them. So the king can take off his crown and put it back on, and that's what makes him a king and not a tyrant. Like that kind of idea where, yeah, for some substances to truly exist and for that substance to have identity is to be in a way, yeah, relating to the thing that was thought to be essential about the substance, but to also negate it. So to be able to negate the substance has a big impact on what it is. And I think as well, like it's also like a king could wear a crown and the crowd could be in gold, and you would think that that's essentially what makes a king. But perhaps what makes a king of kings is not to wear a golden crown, but to wear a crown of other sorts, like a crown of thorns, where all of a sudden we're playing around with the categories of what we think is essential and what we think is necessary for the realization of an identity. But actually, there's a simple inversion that can be made to reveal a deeper and ever greater identity that is the hero or the savior in Christianity.
And this is highly apropos of book Lambda as well, and it's making a reemergence, right? These older ideas, because we're talking explicitly about substance and the component parts that add up and co-constitute what becomes fundamental substance, and the things that constitute it are material, much like the king's crown. They are essential. It's not okay. The king's crown is not essential. Its removability is essential. There's the movement aspect, the continuity nature of, you can take it off his head, you can put it back on. He's the king nonetheless, and it's the fact. It's by fact of removability purely. It's not the fact that he's wearing a crown, not wearing a crown, whether the crown's golden. In some cases, of course, you can play with perception and make the crown a crown of thorns, and that adds to it. But I think for me, what's foundational is the fact that he could not wear a crown. And I think that's what it is when, the crown of thorns, that's kind of what it is. It's a play, and it's a vaudevillian version of simply not wearing a golden crown.
I can take us into Lambda 4 here. And this is where we get the first prefigurings of the unmoved mover. Ultimately, that's the place we're going in Lambda 6 and 7, and it's where Aristotle goes in his teleological account of cause, of change, of existence. And so as Aristotle kind of in Kappa continues his pre-Lambda recappa, he discovers whether all things have the same basic principles and causes. And the answer is not literally, because different kinds of things have different specific elements, but analogically, yes, they do, because the same pattern keeps appearing. So he makes that difference where, in the literal sense, no, but by means of almost that analogic abstraction, yes, we can say that.
Adverbs.
I want to know what the subheading of that book's gonna be. You'll think on it. So the quote
I have it already. Adverbs, metaphysics of disjunction.
That'll sit next to my book Metaphysics of Meaning by Gerald Katz, and I can metaphysics on everything. Yeah, I quote, and since the moving cause in the case of natural things is for man, for instance, man, and in the products of thought, the former or its contrary, there will be, in a sense, three causes, while in a sense there are four. For the medical art is in some sense health, and the building art is the form of the house, and man begets man. Further, besides these, there is that which is first of all things, moves all things. So that's kind of like the play the dramatic dun 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 music, because he's alluding to what's coming up. As you can see, like the painstaking, almost mumbo jumbo that went before that, the effort it takes to decipher just any part of Aristotle's text. To be honest, translators could have potentially done a better job, but we haven't been dealing with the easy part. We've actually been going to like originally what he's saying, the translations being closest in the natural Greek that it was. And so, yeah, we're now getting to a place where Aristotle is starting to set up the premises and the reasons for the unmoved mover, for why does this question come to be? Like, what is the gap in his metaphysics such that there needs to be this dynamic, ever-producing force of movement that itself is eternal? So perhaps do you want to take us into that setup? Was there anything else outstanding in Lambda before that helps to set this up? Or yeah, how do you see this coming about?
Yeah, to set up sort of the main task of the entirety of book Lambda, it was all a bit of a crescendo to Lambda 6 and 7, which is the core component of it. I'll kind of lay out his argument here, and then we can back and forth on our various interpretations of it. But what I found amusing was that this is the key part of metaphysics, and it's perhaps Aristotle at his most, giving us his biggest or best yet nod to physics. A book that it would behoove people to read in tandem with this is Aristotle's Physics, and I almost feel like for him to launch into his metaphysical argument par excellence here, he has to reach into and kind of give us like a physical basis. And why say that? Because up till now, if the questions have been surrounding actuality, potentiality, substance, being, the question kind of suddenly, when he's talking about the prime mover and his, amazing, fanciful, awesome argument that's so famous now, the question isn't to do with any of those things. The question that launches the answer of substance, movement, potentiality, all of that is, why is there eternality? Why is there eternal motion at all? And that seems more, I loved your breakdown earlier. You said something of physics being closer to the natural science that studies the continuous, and then metaphysics being more of the discrete. And so this feels like more of an attempt to answer the question that pervades all of existence of the continuous, the movement, the motion.
It's almost like where and how they come together. Like, what is the essential principle that determines this continuous continuity?
So when we say metaphysics is what is and ethics is what ought, to answer metaphysics as what is, we have to first ask the question of why is. And that seems to be the remit of physics. So it's like an awesome chain of physics, metaphysics, and then you can throw away ethics because that's nonsense, I reckon.
So I guess one of the big questions that we're coming to ask here is, why is?
And here is Aristotle's take. So basically he gives us the argument for the necessary existence of an eternal substance that is immune to change. So if you remember Alex's elucidation from Lambda 1, where he talks about the three different categories that Aristotle lays out of the three kinds of substance, there's the perceptible and the perishable. This falls under natural science. The perceptible and the imperishable also falling under natural science. And then the last category that we kind of breezed over because we were building towards it for now is that which is immune to change, and accordingly the unmoved, because it's immune to change. And so this doesn't fall under natural science. This falls under what he calls logic and mathematic, which also is a science at the time. Here's the argument for the necessary existence of that eternal substance that, like we said, is immune to change. The world itself and time are not perishable. Okay, I'm going to stop Aristotle right there already. because like when he says that, I'm immediately thinking of Eric Weinstein again, who's or that general category of person that is that doomsday alarmist, as I categorize it. Maybe not so much you, but I wholeheartedly agree with Aristotle here. The world itself and time are not perishable. We are here to stay. We're not going anywhere. We've been here for billions of years, and nothing you can experience in your 80 years alive is going to change that. And it's a serious, sick, and twisted savior complex people seem to have regarding this, which I would double down on again. But if you'd like to see me and Alex's wondrous grapple on this topic, on screen now, a previous episode where we speak about Eric Weinstein, real deal or charlatan.
And
But this,
I'll add in here, like, just for my 2 cents, and I'll just put them in as we go, is a little bit of, I felt like it was starting to creep in here. There were some parts of me reading this where I was getting the Wittgenstein ick, where I was like, okay, he's making such claims, he's speaking with such certainty about concepts which we by themselves don't understand, which we like almost definitely can't understand, because how could our intellect grasp something in completeness like time? Like there's real constraints that we have, and that when we put language on it and think that we can know what we're talking about and grasp it, just feels like we're coming up against a barrier. So in and it makes sense because Aristotle is going to like come to this massive cosmological principle, and I do think that it has real ontic depth, but I don't think it lands like in the picture that Aristotle wants it to, because I think we are constrained a little bit by what we can say about such a grand scale metaphysical picture. So it's to say that there's tremendous value in doing this, but it's not just for what the words themselves mean and what Aristotle thinks it's saying.
yeah, and the one line we said so far, which is the world itself and time are not perishable, it's outlandish, right? Like right from the get-go, like what are you actually saying? Like I want to agree with you, and I do, but I'm not going to like bet my life on that, you know? No one's asking me to, but I'm also not going to. And then, okay, so the world itself and time are not perishable, but this can only be the case if there is something immanent that is itself imperishable. So that seems to make ready sense. Therefore, there must be an eternal and imperishable substance. He doesn't speak of time, space, location here, perhaps because you can't, because of the nature of the thing we're speaking of. We agree that there is a whole that is distinct from its parts. That's actually its specialty. It's a different entity because the whole, I guess you could say the eidos here loosely, has to be distinct from its parts, and it's a completely fundamentally separate category that he's moving us slowly towards and telling us what his account of it is. Immediately, he, portends a foreseeable objection, because you would say that because the whole world is imperishable, it doesn't naturally follow that anything in it is also imperishable. The world itself as a category, whatever the hell that means, could be imperishable, but there could be minute factions, there could be individual things existing in their various manifold multiplicities that might be themselves perishable, not changing the very nature of the cosmos and the world itself. So you kind of think, okay, like the first line of reasoning you drew from the world being perishable to, but that can only be the case if there is something in it that's imperishable, is kind of, I don't know if it's flawed, but it's just a huge leap that he's making there. Kind of the objection you raised, Alex, of you're really doing a lot of work to give him credit for his compression of reality into such giant statements. Anyway, and so that's one objection that he that you could levy at it very firmly. It's also, just for people following along that want to just like a condensed name for it, it's called the fallacy of distribution. For Aristotle, though, the eternal substance has being as pure actuality, and he would explain the production of the world very contra the Platonic forms. This is probably a talking point for us to back and forth on before we progress, but I think for Aristotle, the term that kept coming to mind was that the forms hold a place, obviously same as Plato, but in a different way. And the distinction could be explained with something having explanatory prowess, which I think is the case for Aristotle's depiction of forms versus Plato's forms, which is something that is rigorous and revelatory. And so that was an interesting sort of distinguishing I found. But I think, yeah, the actus purus, as it's said in Latin, was the key discovery in this passage. He talks about because this, following that line of reasoning he started this chapter with, he says that because this substance is, eternality is a condition on that of anything else, it itself must be in actuality, because how ludicrous, how farcical would it be if the thing that is the condition on that of anything else was itself a matter of potentiality? Because while he pays a lot more credit and homage to the reality of something that is only existing in potentiality, it is ultimately potentiality. And yes, there are parameters that constrain it, and there is a certain direction and final cause to the potential's realization or entelechy, as we discovered in the last 2-3 episodes. Ultimately, the thing that gives rise has to itself be actual, and actual, imperishable, eternal, not going anywhere, and maybe not intelligible, but itself in its reality be actual. So the term that is used is, yeah, actus purus, which is pure act or pure actuality. So yeah, we can probably pause there before moving on and yeah, get some thoughts from Alexis as well.
Yeah, I thought that he did do a good job of setting up in Lambda 6 what was needed, and like where the limits of philosophers before him and his philosophy hitherto was lacking. And he has been obsessed with explaining change and going to great lengths to criticize Plato, to say how, yeah, you run into this infinite regress if you have forms over there and you have the things down here, and the forms are participating, or the matter is participating in the forms but isn't co-identical with it, and so there must be some intermediary form that it's partaking in, and then that also must have an intermediary, and so on and so on. He's been obsessed with explaining, yeah, change and movement, and as you talk to there, like now that we have these categories of potential and actual, what must the unmoved mover exist in? Like, does it have an equal mix of both? Is it one or the other? And actus purus is, as you were saying, is more of the principle of total actualization rather than having any potential. And I thought that he set it up well, and I've picked out a few quotes from Lambda 6. And so he's looking for eternal movement. And I quote, "It is impossible that movement should either have come into being or cease to be." And so it's a little bit of lending, in the line of what you had said with time and movement kind of being imperishable, because time and movement could almost be said to be the same thing. And also he's looking for, so first, eternal movement, second, change. And I quote, "Nothing then is gained, even if we suppose eternal substances as the believers in the forms do, unless there is to be in them some principle which can cause change." So he's also seen the limitations of Plato's metaphysics, and also, yeah, determinate influence as the third. So something that has a real causal impact on this world, where for the forms it's potentially ambiguous as to whether they actually impact and exert like a top-down influence on the world. And I quote, "But if there is something which is capable of moving things or acting on them, but is not actually doing so, there will not necessarily be movement, for that which is potency needs not exercise it. Nothing then is gained, even if we suppose eternal substances as the believers in the forms do, unless there is to be in them some principle which can cause a change." So the prelude to that was almost saying it needs to have determinate influence, and then it needs to have change. So it's not just enough to suppose something eternal to describe how creativity continues to unfold, and how matter continues to generate, and how patterns continue to reoccur. You need to go further to actually find something which does have, by its nature, this close relationship to and influence on the things of this world. And fourthly, and this is the point that you were making towards the end there, which, yeah, fits into his setup in Lambda 6, a principle whose essence is actuality, so eternal actuality. And quoting Aristotle, "If its essence is potency, there will not be eternal movement, since that which is potentially may not possibly be." So he's saying if there was some kind of potency in the first cause, the unmoved mover, then there's a way in which there's something in it still to be realized. There's a way in which it must negate itself, or limit itself to reveal more of its potential. So Aristotle is saying that the unmoved mover sits in the camp of pure actuality. And it's interesting because on that point, I'll read a quote from David Bentley Hart's book, The Experience of God. And it's a little bit of identifying God as the being whose essence is existence. Um, in this book, which is written from that Neoplatonic lens and is quite aligned with like Orthodox Christianity. The kind of mystical side of that is, he's looking at these different categories of essence and existence, still really taking these Aristotelian ideas and Platonic ideas and putting them in deep dialogue. And from this orthodox line, like one of the attributes that we could ascribe to God is that it's where essence and existence meet, that to exist in essentiality, which is often something that's what things are always trying to get to, but so we're trying to essentially be witnesses and bearers of God, but we fail and we sin, and so in our existence we're sinning, but in our essence we have a spark of the divine. But for God, the essence and existence is one and the same. So I quote, "In God, however, as he is infinite actuality and supereminent fullness, there can be no distinction between what he is and that he is. Infinite existence is its own essence. Infinite existence is its own existence." And so I think it's interesting to see the connections that these ideas do have for modern mystical Christianity. Like there's some real, and that this is the value in this section. It's not just to follow him logically and understand what he's saying about time and non-perishableness and movement, but it's to follow the move he's making and see if that flight of the imagination does give us any further credit. Like, what can Aristotle be made to say as a Christian is how some of him has been taking up. And Thomas Aquinas, who wrote extensive notes over all of Aristotle's works, is one of the people that really revived intellectual thought during the Dark Ages, where there was war-stricken lands and there was chaos and there was, we're humans really struggling to overcome those primal urges. And yet Aristotle comes in and is brought back to life through Thomas Aquinas. And then, what we see today is how that produces a frame for understanding God and coming into contact with the existence of God, as the book is called.
The monstrous monstrosity of Aquinas. It's a little surprising it took us till almost an hour and a half to bring up his name, given that we're talking about Aristotle's God. Yeah, I particularly liked what you're saying about essence as existence and the meeting point, right? The union is the source of the communion that extends itself into what we call the sacred covenant.
Yeah. The
And
union is the source of the communion. Yeah.
And ultimately, what extends by definition, by necessity, into what the agent arena relationship is, which is the sacred covenant, the eternal promise, right? And so, it's a heartwarming removal from the cognizing subject world that we live in, where it's actually existence as essence, you could say, in a weird, essential way. But to return to that Platonic sentiment of essence as existence is really just something you can descend and drop into bodily, and it feels sublime. I really liked the terminology you used of there is no difference in what he is and that he is, given that one of the throwaway definitions we established early on for God was that which affords, right? That he affords and what he affords are indistinguishable in some sense. And the word that I newly learned this week that I was saying at the start, ratiocinate, I feel like Aristotle is methodologically ratiocinating us to Lord Krishna. And I quote from the Bhagavad Gita. He says, so this is all from Lord Krishna when he's counseling the warrior prince Arjuna and revealing his true identity as and this is how it relates to Lambda 6 and 7, is Krishna is the 8th avatar of Vishnu and the imperishable Godhead, which roughly speaking is what I'm thinking of when Aristotle moves us rigorously towards this. He says, knowing these mystical details, you glimpse my divine power. You know that whatever you sense or perceive in the entire cosmos is that power, and you therefore know that you could no more be separate from me than you could be separate from your very life. Wise yogis love me ceaselessly. They know that the love they're experiencing for me is me, for I am love. Just as the good farmer puts all his attention onto the soil, concentrating his mind fully on cultivating the land, yogis give their minds and hearts fully to the divine, knowing that God alone is the source of everything. To those who give me their whole hearts, I confer buddhi, which means sense, intellect, the power of discriminating between the real and not real. As familiarity with my power and glory grows, they are ever more ardently drawn to me. I am their wisdom. Out of compassion, I choose to dwell in their hearts, and from there I dispel dark ignorance with the light of knowing that they are the divinity within. That same union as communion idea, and each of them enforcing and reinforcing one another, it's moving us into, you could say, communion with the imperishable Godhead, as depicted in Hindu traditions with Lord Krishna. So
yeah, very nice. And it's cool to see the ways in which Aristotelianism can extend to different cultural points. It's interesting how philosophy, is aspiring to have breadth and depth, and to see consonances there is reassuring. And also shows the kind of creative impact that the idea can have, right, when it's echoed in different separate lines of religious sentiment. I think an interesting lens I like to apply, and one that we can bring in here, is from none other than Carl Jung. And this is, I would almost think of the unmoved mover as Aristotle's encounter with his self, the capital S self.
yeah.
And I think like Jung probably, I wouldn't be surprised if Jung takes an example of Aristotle's unmoved mover as like one of the analogies he uses for the self. But Jung also mostly understood the self through dreams and fantasies of his own almost psychosis that he had, but of also his patients, as a psychotherapist that would come to him and through treatment have certain dreams that would reveal it. So Jung's epistemology was, not just through philosophy, but also through intuition and through imagination. And I think, like maybe there's a part of Aristotle's psyche where he is looking for something to unify and cohere around. Like he's creating this beautiful mandala, but he just hasn't finished the center node. And the center node is where all of it comes to the one fractal axis point. And so, there's one way to think about this as the unmoved mover, as Aristotle's encounter with the self, and almost in a way where you couldn't not have this encounter. From outset, to go into metaphysics, you necessarily need that zero principle. You need the source and cause of all things. And for Jung, that is, the self is the conductor of the psyche, and the different musical components are the archetypes. But the self is what it all revolves around and is the source of all that movement. So it's interesting to think of the Jungian notion of the self as an analogy to, Aristotle's unmoved mover as a metaphysical principle.
Certainly, yes. Yeah, that's one parallel I'd never drawn, but now that you say it, you know that it's a good truth when it just seeps into your bones straight away, much like a lot of the Freudian insights, right? Like it was so profound that we just accepted it historically, politically, sociologically, immediately, and you thought, wow, okay, this was so apparent and obvious, but that's just because it wasn't. It was just so moving that it fit right in. Yes. Unmoved mover as the self, as Rafiki, you might even say, existing fundamentally in the shadows, in liminal spaces, but existing more in unliminality than ever before. Yeah, cross-cultural, cross-time, enforcing that which is present and uneternal, informing that which is subject to decay and pathology, but also uplifting those very things by dint of its pure actuality. Yeah, wow. No, that's a great thought, man. And there's something, you don't really want to personify this thing. I guess it's strange to personify even Lord Krishna because he's not a person. It's strange to personify the self into a Disney character as it is with the unmoved mover. Aristotle perhaps deliberately leaves it uncharacterized, unnarrativized. I almost feel like he might have had this small sinking temptation to want to turn this part of Lambda into a play. Like, okay, so like let me write my own Bacchae or my own Antigone or something, And it would have been the easiest part to do that with, because through pictures and through visualization, it would have made this whole thing a lot simpler. Perhaps not as well, because the panoply of interpretations that would proliferate from there would actually add a lot of material, but not necessarily substance to drawing us closer and closer to this unmoved mover. And something we did right at the start of this Lambda was kind of dispel with the presupposition that the world and time itself are imperishable, that Aristotle said. But to be team Aristotle for a second, and now given reading this whole book, team Aristotle for the rest of my life, I would say, in favor of him. Even there's this argument that I came across that even if time was destroyed, it would have to be destroyed at a specific time, thereby invoking that there's a pre-destruction and a post-destruction. So that's only the case for organic beings, which is why it makes sense that he would kind of say that time itself is imperishable, because time is not an organic being the way humans, the way mammals, the way amphibians are. Non-organic, imperishable substances like the world and time don't experience decay. So yeah, just a little nod to Aristotle as well. Like maybe your thing is outlandish, but not so outlandish.
Yeah. Kind of shows you what you can do when you reach for the stars. Because that is what Aristotle's doing. He is looking to the heavens, and that's kind of what he analogizes at the start. That's why he has a category of substance that you can't destroy, that is eternal. So you have this, the prime substance for Aristotle, which sets everything into motion, but that it itself is non-destructible and didn't have a beginning or an end. It is a constant, and he's looking to the stars to get that. And I think as well, like what I'm meaning there is like looking to the self, like looking to the depths within to reflect and refract the depths without, as above, so below. That there is real weight to that idea. And if you have a good grasp on the steering wheel of your ship, then you can take it to a pretty interesting destination.
Like this is depicted amazingly in Renaissance paintings, with Mary with her head in the night sky, the infinite sky, and being enamored of it, but with her feet on the head of a snake.
Yes, with the stars all around as a halo, and just how she is totally between worlds in that image. Yeah, I think it's
The fusion.
It's Aristotle being totally between worlds here as well. Interesting. And it's partly why Dante, the Italian poet, Florentine poet, had Aristotle and Plato in his. I think he actually had Aristotle ranked above Plato and however he did, but in his cosmogony of pre-Christians who also entered into, or they were in, not in paradise, but the one before it, in purgatory. So they were there, or in the first heavens. They had some kind of status in his cosmology because they were not Christians. So they didn't know Christ, so they couldn't be in paradise. But they had that gift of divinity to see and stand between worlds like this, and to be a guide for someone and for people in that time. So Dante also gives a lot of credit to Aristotle and Plato for their ability to, as you say, like stand between worlds. I think where we're at now, like we've in this episode covered a bit of the setup of where Aristotle, how he wants to set up the unmoved mover, and talk about how there needs to be an eternal movement, there needs to be change, determinate influence on the world, and like a kind of eternal actuality. And we've then now looked at some of the psychological components to that and how there might be that Jungian lens of Aristotle having and making contact with the self. But I want to make sure that for our listeners, we can give a really clear picture and even give some real concrete ideas to what this unmoved mover might be. So let's drop into Lambda 7, and just before, or to get us there, again, to kind of bring a modern example to it, I think you could make a strong case that you have several unmoved movers today, from, again, like borrowing from the laws of physics. And we said before how Aristotle had 55 unmoved movers to account for all of the stars in the night sky, all of the celestial beings that moved according to their own corresponding dynamic. Like some moved quite linearly through the sky, quite slowly. Other stars moved quite fast and would recur, at certain times in the year. So he postulated all these different unmoved movers with kind of different substances causing this movement. But I think it's interesting, and we can talk about how the laws of physics are like their own laws that govern and guide and propel things and explain how a particular interaction or cause and effect takes place, all the while not ever moving themselves. The law of Newton's law of motion, or Maxwell's equations, or the laws of thermodynamics, all hold constant as far as we can tell. We don't have evidence to show how they're changing or moving in any significant way. And yet there's so much that is conforming to those constraints. So much that, just mass having a gravitational pull, that's something where the gravitas of a planet is not something that moves, but it in space-time completely warps the area around it and just brings everything closer. And so even to bring this point home, to quote Rupert Sheldrake, since the 17th century, physicists have believed that nature is determined by mathematical equations which are beyond space-time and which are somehow instantiated within the phenomenon of nature, without any explanation or discussion of how that might happen. So that quote is bringing a few things to the fore. And so just before I hand over to you, Luca, I'll say that my reflections on that quote was, how there is that presumption within physics to assume the status of these laws of nature. We just call them laws. And what is a law but something that you cannot question, right? That was like socially agreed upon for a certain reason, but it is held up by humanity. And so a law of nature is something that we almost can't explain exactly why it's come to be, but we can just see that it has come to be. Neil deGrasse Tyson often says, like, there's a certain limit where physics doesn't need to go beyond to like keep asking why. As long as we can make predictions, as long as we can put man on the moon, then we're happy. And so there's a certain level where just the practicality of physics is where its value grounds out, but not an ultimate understanding is where the value grounds out. And I think Aristotle is here, really starting that discussion or getting to the explanation of how there can be things which are outside of space-time that are causing and instantiated within the phenomenon of nature. So he's, going beyond physics in some ways in what he's doing philosophically. And it also just goes to show the culture of science and where we are there, and how, certain eternal laws are kind of just the norm. And so Aristotle's, certain eternal law is also just the norm for Aristotle and for philosophers of that time.
Yeah, wow. There's so much there. There's also, I wonder if there's a little bit of a fear to the acceptance of these eternal laws and norms and social even mores, if you will. Those aren't eternal, but they're more products of epistemes. But either way, you kind of think, is there a fear undergirding this, that to question one would unravel the tapestry and the house of cards would come down? This is kind of what I was trying to get at, but not as articulately as I would have liked to, when we were talking about how the law of non-contradiction has risen in my weight, in the weight that I want to give it. I was thinking, well, if you question this, then you have to question 6 other things, and I'd rather just accept this. And I don't even like agree. I only just agree because otherwise I have to question everything else. And it was just like a source of retaining sanity. So I wonder if that resonates with you.
Adverbs, adverbs, adverbs.
Oh man, I don't know why I heard that as ass verbs, and I was thinking, Thick Lizzie did not make an appearance today. But yeah, man, I was gonna say I love the point you said about to try and make this more cogent for viewers as well. Like mass, anything that has mass has gravitational pull, and we don't kind of question that, right? In the physical world, we just think, yeah, that is the first cause in that particular instance and scenario. And so when Aristotle's talking of the the unmoved mover, we're kind of speaking of the launcher, the like initial propeller of movement itself. And he's moving us towards this, and it's kind of like a synthesizing of all his key ideas, including the four causes, where you kind of think, well, when all of this comes together, put tidily in front of you and presented on the ass of a Lizzie, then you think, okay, well, the answer is that, you know? And I wanted to move us along a little bit, but through a quote, and then we'll break down the quote a little bit. But he says, in Lambda 7, the intrinsic object of thought is what is intrinsically best, and the intrinsic object of absolute thought is the absolute best. And in apprehending its object, thought thinks itself, for it too becomes an object for itself by its contact with and thinking of its object, so that the thought and its object are one and the same. So we're really moving towards a type of fusion and union between thinker, thought, and the process itself. To move us along in that way, I think, put simply, he's talking about how he thinks that when we desire something, we believe it to be good. We desire it because we believe it to be good. We don't believe something is good because we desire it. And so when we're talking about the launcher of the movement of desire, in that case, it's the thought that it's good that starts the process. That starts things off. In the case of the planets orbiting around some sort of celestial being with an insane mass, it's the fact that that's where the emphasis would lie. That's where the gravitational pull would emerge from. It's very, I guess in this case, to start us off, it's one directional, and then when you enter that vibrational frequential relationship and you get locked into that sacred covenant, it becomes increasingly bi-directional and all directional. But I guess for Aristotle, it's important to state that it's the thought that something is good. It's the thought that this or that needs to happen that starts things off. It's not the other way around. And then, he writes here, the object of desire and the object of thought produce movement. The object of appetite is what seems good. We can move towards the supremacy he places on contemplation, but any thoughts on that?
Yeah, let me just drop in and swim around a little bit. I'm going to just submerge and then re-emerge and see where we are.
That's a lot of verbs, man.
Philosophy is swimming, but without a pull. I like where you're going to bring up this cognitive act that is the unmoved mover. I think that, you need to understand Aristotle and to understand then the tradition of idealism, like see the ways in which when we're talking about unmoved mover, we're not talking about a demiurge. We're not talking about the atheist God who by some command or some instruction causes things to happen. We're talking about what are we talking about?
Can I just say, I think what we're talking about is we kickstart at the microcosm layer an alliance with the eternal, the unmoved mover, and its pure actuality, which itself is existent, reveals itself as such to us when we kickstart the process. So no, it's not the atheist God, something that's there, but Krishna doesn't reveal himself to Lord Arjuna until the opportune moment. There's a fortuitousness to it that's kickstarted by the anguish, in this case, experienced by Arjuna. It's not random. Ultimately, it's probably random, but there's a specific situation and transpiring of events and feelings and affects that need to cohere for this to begin.
There's a timely quality where we ourselves, and it's kind of what we alluded to at the start of the good news and the bad news of philosophy, is that it's up to you to take it up. And so when we kickstart, when we get into that contemplative mode, when we want to seek out what is really real or what is really at the source, we find we find ourselves, we find ourself, thought thinking itself. It's a
Through
little bit
thus.
of, yeah, through the self, exactly. Which is, yeah, the self is our own little microcosmic unmoved mover, which for Aristotle as well moved the life of all things. So one way of almost thinking about this is as the propulsion that nature has in and of its own essence. So the essence of nature in some sense is the unmoved mover, because for Aristotle, physics was about the principles of motion and rest. And nature is about principles of motion and rest. Physics and nature were very, very similar, natural philosophy. And when you take that back to like the very basic energy that is housed by so much expression, you get something like an unmoved mover. It's this dynamic energy which expresses itself through the forms of material, but it itself has its internal coherence, like the forms do, like the form and the matter for Aristotle, the form and matter. And yeah, there's something like dynamic in it, the crux of things. I'll also say that, yeah, to move us away from that thinking about it as something like a godly act, like what if the unmoved mover was the intersection between the vertical and horizontal dimensions of life? What if it was in all areas of life, was at the center, where it had that quality of being at the center, but that center being everywhere, because it's a principle that's common to all things. The act of my thinking and the act of the laptop supporting this and your own act of thinking and of existing, all of that existing at this extension of the horizontal layer. But then what's vertical about it? How there's an ontology which extends beyond itself to all things. And that extension is, yeah, part and parcel of the moving of something. But yeah, that moving takes place eternally. Just some musings on like, yeah, what if we can also take this unmoved mover and not try and have it in some time and place, but have it everywhere and constitutively a part of everything?
Yeah, and the unmoved mover is perhaps closer to that there is time and place rather than be situated in a time or place, right? I'm even
Yes.
thinking of the distinction between representation and non-representation as delineated by Schopenhauer, and how the unmoved mover has these parallels to the will, or Jung's, it's not the same, but even the unus mundus, right? And how it's, you use the perfect term, intersection of the vertical and the horizontal, yeah. And the meeting point of that being this unbridled access to unus mundus, and that being kickstarted at the micro layer by the person's specific moment in space and time, giving you access to that which is neither of those things.
And this is why it's the trunk of the tree, because the branches are catching the light and are taking us to that horizontal, spiritual, anagogic ascent. And then the vertical and then the horizontal being the roots that branch into the soil and into the earth and into the earthly spheres. And the trunk is that which can hold both together. So yeah, the axis mundus, is, yeah, exactly like what I would be trying to take unmoved mover and put it there. And that's just my instinct. I'm sure that's been done, but yeah, for Aristotle, it's almost like he talks about it in such the way such that it is a one starting point, like a big bang kind of start of a linear sequence. But I want to try and see if we can move it into being an axis mundi that is always here if we bring our attention to that. And when we do bring our attention to it, it becomes bidirectional, as you were alluding to.
Absolutely, man. Yeah, really well said. All right, let's move along. So yeah, in the second half of Lambda 7, Aristotle kind of doubles down on what he said before, which is that the quality of thinking that we do, since we're moving towards contemplation also in the historical sense as being defined closer to meditation, he says that the quality of thinking we do as thinkers depends on the object of thought, right? This is his reasoning as to how we move towards this is, if you're meditating on something that is banal, mundane, inane, then the result of that source and the object of thought will be equally whatever you input will be the output. So given that that is also a natural law of reality and experience of reality, Aristotle kind of moves us and says, why would you not just meditate on the highest object possible of thought? There's also an admits of precision element that I always bring up from the Nicomachean Ethics of geometry admits of exactitude. Rhetoric does not. There's an innate demand of the field, and he says a noble object will produce a nobler contemplation than a trivial one. He doesn't say that. I said that actually, but I'll let him have it. So yeah, if that holds, that the noble, a noble object produces nobler contemplation from the contemplator than a trivial object would, or an ignoble one would, surely the necessary fallout from that is that the highest thinker, the highest contemplator must think of the noblest thing. And so the question then becomes, what is the noblest thing?
This is where like the noblest thing is, and this is where the bidirectionally comes into it, Luca. It's when we go from thinking that like we are thinking thought, like when we turn contemplatively to the contents of our psyche, when we turn to the form of thought as the subject of thought, then what's produced is itself the source of movement. So you have this looping effect where the source of movement, our psyche, gets put toward the form of thought as its thought. And the product of that is, self-reflection on something. And then that is stimulating the process. So you can see where there's this feedback loop of like pure synthetic cognitive energy that's created in that construct. And I think it's what I also want to bring in here is, and this kind of opened up a few doors to me because it's easy to get stuck in this whole just being in the mind too much when doing this. And we are the armchair philosophers for this episode, so it's kind of fine. But you don't have the epistemic legs when you're just tied up in the subject object subjecting subject nature. And so to kind of bring that to a new dimension and give it a new flavor, like what if the bidirectional component of this is that we stop thinking thought itself, but thought is thinking itself through us? What if there's a flip where all of a sudden, because we are contemplating the highest good and because we are, our desire is turned towards the highest form of thought, what if it then starts to, what we actually come to realize when we go on that flight is that it hasn't been our thinking doing this, it's been pure thought impressing itself on us through that way because of our divine aspiration to be in contact with that, and so it's the higher coming down to the lower, to not because it just wants to, but because it has to reveal itself more divinely. The higher principle to exist at all these ontological levels, to be divine, means it has to come down to these lower, more human, more earthly levels, and so that we have this divinity descending into our personal confines, and we can be revealed deep truths about metaphysics.
I'm even thinking of Deus Ex Machina and the intrusion of the gods periodically into our lives, and that as a symbolic concept. You deserve a cookie for not bringing up Hegel and sidestepping that man's name in that entire little riff there. Bravo and commiseration.
I won't tell you my sources.
I think I wanted to address my usage of the word bidirectionality. That is only an initial stage. After that, there's a collapse of thinking, thought, and thinker into one. And what that means is meditation on the right. And so that's actually closer. There's a negative emotive aspect to the word implosion, especially because of Baudrillard and hyperreality and from simulacra and simulation. But this is a healthy, noble implosion of thought, thinker, and what's the other one? Thought, thinker, and thought into one. And it's only bidirectional or unidirectional to begin
thinking.
With. Yeah, they very quickly not only intersect, but they meld. And yet it's equally necessary for the higher to descend into the lower for its own sake. Like, it's pure actuality, but somehow still needs us. Like, it's strange. No. Okay, so I was just going to say on that note as well, you mentioned we're necessarily armchair philosophers. We've accepted our fate for this episode, but I also want to address something else from the Gita that addresses this exact sentiment of dhyana yoga, contemplating yourself into divinity. That's only one of the four yogas. Yoga obviously just means union, right? And so that's only one of the four. The other ones, karma yoga. Karma, obviously, like, we reduce it down into some sort of retribution, restitution type in and out equation in our language today. But there's, karma yoga, jnana yoga, bhakti yoga, which is simply devotion, like simply having a heartfelt love towards that which is higher than you, slowly moves you towards the thing. And then dhyana yoga, which is different, which is simply just meditating on the thing. So, like, quite literally our modern understanding of meditation. You don't need to think your way to the divine. There are different modes, and they're actually inbuilt for your personality type, and you just have to self-select where you fit in. And no one, again, it's not a Street Fighter thing. It's not like, I'm this guy, so I'm going to do this pathway and then I'm going to get there. It's a intricate and tricky mix of all four that you have to incorporate into your day-to-day life, speaking very practically and expediently to launch yourself there.
Yeah, I really appreciate the different modalities and just bringing that up to keep us grounded, right, and keep us at our sharpest when we go heavily into one direction, to also go, okay, wait, and this is just like one direction that we can go down, but there's also multiple avenues that are going to enhance and strengthen us. I want to pick up on this idea of karma, because one thing Aristotle says is how the unmoved mover kind of influences things through desire, that the desire and the longing for something is actually what is kind of the cause of moving. And so a quote from Lambda 7, and the object of desire and the object of thought move in this way. They move without being moved. And it's partly like he uses this image because when you desire something so much, the dragon scroll, right? to go back to the old faithful, the dragon scroll is the unmoved mover, because it's causing so much. It's creating this whole community of dragon warriors to come forth, to train, to be absolute masters. And Poe, he knows it like mythically in the distance, but he's really concerned with this intermediary group of warriors that protect the land. And then only when he gets to that level of now he can protect the land does the whole unmoved moving that was at the source of it all become relevant to him. And so what I mean is the fantasy of the Dragon Scroll was absolutely inspiring and empowering the Fantastic Five, the
Furious Five.
The Furious Five, fantastically Furious Five, and also the adversary. It was also the dualism of Tai Long being really like wanting to take it by force. So he let the unmoved mover really command his desire for it, and all the while this scroll, this image, this idea, this motivation holds steadfast in the minds, and in its existence holds steadfast. And so it's through that influence that it has on the aspiration of things that causes them to move, yet it itself doesn't move. And so that's where you can get this notion of thought thinking itself. We know kind of when that mirror is reflected to thought, you just have that kind of infinite looping, energy producing kind of self-rotating wheel. But also the movement that happens is because everything is almost attracted, through the state of affection or love or desire to the unmoved mover that causes things to move. So Kung Fu Panda is an example to elucidate that component of desire, of how we are all moved by, and that's just common sense. We're all moved by things in our life. We're moved to do this series for the aspiration of bringing Aristotle to more, by being philosophers, by having something to do that's worthwhile. All of these kind of pseudo unmoved movers, and potentially are a way to start bridging the gap to what Aristotle's unmoved mover is, but we can see semblances of it just by in our first person experience.
Yeah, and at a completely abstract theoretical level, you could just depict the unmoved mover as simply that which gathers and assembles the multiplicitous into one. That's a very, I guess, even a religious way of looking at it, but take it as that if you'd like to. And I think this is a perfect place. I wanted to ask you about your musings on worship. And when you brought up the Dragon Scroll, just to kind of give space here and context for why I want to ask you this, I almost think like, wow, if there was something that could usurp the primacy and fundamentality of power as being the harbinger and the arbiter of all of reality as I experience it, if I was to take, if the concept of power was to be supplanted, it would be either by hope or no, that's the only option. It would have to be hope, not love. It would be hope. But I actually think what I mean when I say hope is something like desire. And I only kind of realized that now in the last 30 seconds. And I did want to ask you about, because in the case of Kung Fu Panda, the Dragon Scroll is also the unspoken, the unwritten source of worship, and also that which is sacred, right? Everyone is at a varying and differing level of relationship and vibration to the frequency that is the Dragon Scroll and them locked in this alliance and dalliance, even you could say, right? Shifu has his relationship to the Dragon Scroll. He feels like he's the deciding factor as to who's fit and who's not, or he perceives himself that way until Oogway steps in and decides, right? Oogway, you mentioned him as the master of dialectic, that who sees the bigger picture always can break frame out of his own frame when necessary, almost like autodidactically teaching himself a new skill on the spot when it befits the situation. It's absurd, his wisdom. He also knows when to like off himself, right? Like that's cool. That's very Socratic. And then, Poe has his relation, he has his own deliberate non-relation to the Dragon Scroll, and thereby creating a stronger relation on the ground. Tai Lung has a decrepit, depraved relation to the Dragon Scroll as well. And you just think, well, okay, so if that's the source of so much splendor and the source of so much provocation for all these individual characters, isn't that what's sacred? And is sacred what is pure, untouched, the source of all being, the light, in a sense, the sun? And yeah, I mean, of course, this begets the question of worship and how we relate to the idea of worship. So I wonder if you have any thoughts that fuse all of this together, even at a more personal level, if you're called to answer that way. What is the grounds for worship? Do we decide? Does it pick us? Like I said, with Lord Krishna descending as an avatar of Lord Vishnu, we don't say, oh, I wish I could have Lord Krishna come into my life now. When he doesn't even exist conceptually. He descends, he exists for the next few millennia, and then he ascends and goes away again. So, and then the other thing I want to ask you about worship as well is, if our attention can go there, say on the object of worship, must there necessarily be substance, or can our attention go to something that is, say, fraudulent? Or is charlatanism even a thing in worship? Or if your mind goes there, it's necessarily noble if it's above you? So yeah, how do you kind of discriminate between all of these sort of factions of the sacred and the worship? I'm even thinking of adages like false idols. Is there a place in your worldview for something like that? And yeah, where do you sit with all this?
It was, yeah, beautifully mixed together and served. I do think that the question will be better than the answer because there's just a lot there. Yeah, like, and what I'm hearing in the question is like, what's the ratio religio of God? What's the right relation to the realms of divine, and how should we comport ourselves to be in relation to that and to celebrate the power that it has, to celebrate the spirit that it gives? Yeah, worship is almost something that we do together quite a lot. So how do we as well relate to what is sacred and divine and do so in a community? So yeah, what is binding us together about it? I have a lot more kind of questions that I could go to and unpack. I think part of a subset of your question was, is all worship good, or are there some forms of worship which are actually negative or detrimental? And I think certainly, like, yeah, the conflation of idols and icons is one of the key ways that we can be misguided about what we are seeking to worship. And I'll even lean on some of the biblical underpinnings of how, the Ten Commandments first came into existence was when Moses went up onto the mountain, I think Mount Sinai, but I'm not totally sure. He went and received the commandments, and as he went, his brother Levi, who was the priest, Moses was the chief, Levi was the priest. All these people suddenly become so dysregulated and disruptive because now Moses is gone and they've been in the desert for how long, and they still haven't found anything sacred. They still haven't heard God talking to them. God's just told them to get out. They've done that, and now they're having such a difficult time. And so he brings gold together and molds this golden cow to give people something to worship. And so Moses is basically, as soon as they get the commandments, they go and worship a golden cow. They create a false image of God just to kind of rest themselves and rest their projections. And so there's always this threat of icons creeping into the picture when we go to celebrate and worship. And I think because there's so much that's worthy of worship, it is hard to differentiate what is actually the worth that we are worshiping. And we can be confused by assuming the worth is in another object or entity, or not even object or entity, but like sports team, or piece of music, or favorite movie, or favorite TV series, or favorite plate of food. Like all of these things that we do worship that aren't giving back to us the fullness that we need for the fullness of our worship to really be what it is. And so there's definitely a proper placement of that worship. And I think it's not as straightforward as just make sure you're worshiping God. Like, I think for a lot of people, the safe bet is in worshiping God, because you do have a set of ethics and morals and community that goes along with it that does keep you in relatively safe keeping and keep you in close enough distance to like what is ultimately good. I think when we're worshiping, we should seek to worship what is ultimately good. That should receive most of our worship, and then the lesser things that are further down in that hierarchy of what we should worship, like your next might be your immediate family, or it might be people in general. We should have that ordering in the things we worship. And I think that, yeah, even if it's not like the greatest, most accurate image of God, even if it's a God that, cares who you're having around for dinner, cares what you're eating day to day, cares who you sleep with, like that's maybe not the God that is completely out there, but it does correspond at least in some way and stands on a tradition. So I can see the value in like almost naively worshipping the God of religion, the God of Christianity, and that being at least somewhat better than trying to find your own thing to worship, like your own intellect, right? Like pride. And almost in Dostoevsky's book of Crime and Punishment, does he start to worship his own idol of his own intelligence and the unfairness of life, such that he is so intelligent but hasn't been able to crack life, and so that his sister doesn't have to basically prostitute herself to a husband, he commits a murder. And that's where that form of what you're worshiping has really become perverse, and something has taken the top, which is God's throne, by something lower, and you see that play out. So yeah, I think, and then I think further to that, yeah, the icon is what reveals more of the divine. So as we worship, as we sing in chorus and in symphony, and as we give thanks, as we pour our heart out to, as we declare our love for, we should also feel that connection. We should feel that connecting back to us at some level. And that's one of the sure signs that you are worshipping and in ratio religio to a compelling and worthy mover of your soul. And for me, even spontaneously, yeah, I was taught when I was younger this tradition in meditation, which is, just saying, I love you, God, Jesus, etc., and just repeating that. And that's all the prayer needs to be. That's enough. Like, God smiles back when you hold him in that regard. And so it can be very simple. And for me, that's just something that's stuck. There's something that I haven't moved away from in that. And the more I live and the older I get, the deeper that becomes, as the more I just repeat it simply what it is and see it in a new light day to day. So there's a real strength to, yeah, finding the right thing and like feeling it click with you.
That's a colossal answer. Really, really fun to listen to. I have many strands I want to pick on that and then move us along to the end of Lambda after that as well. So yeah, I mean, one of the things you said was just, yeah, kind of idol worship as well. I was thinking of the concept of idolatry. It's another one of those terms that's garnered a reputation for being a pejorative, I think undeservedly. I think it's crazy that you would call the worship of idols, be it in the form, again, the word form is key here, of an effigy or studying iconography. Why is that seemed as diminished when most people cannot fathom the formless version of the true nature of their God because it's formless? And you can only fashion it, you can only envision it through sensation and energetically. And given that that takes sometimes multiple lifetimes, depending on your stance on afterlife and reincarnation, I think it's a really good, safe bet that you should just worship the God that you can see, perceive, experience, and in front of you, you can imagine, you can envision it. Go with that. It's a good bet. There aren't many better bets than that. And if you're an atheist, self-proclaimed, just name the thing that you're worshiping anyway, because there's no non-worshiping option. Call it a God.
No,
Own it.
exactly. Know that you're worshiping. Know that you're worshiping, that you can't help but worship, because to worship something is to prioritize it, to give more attention to it. Like attention is a form of worship. And so we're on our phones for hours in a day, we're worshiping that, and it's not a currency that gives back to us. And yeah, to what you're saying about atheists as well, it's you don't have to worship God, but know that you are worshiping and just know what you're worshiping so that you can be clear in that. And that's fine, but we are doing it.
Yeah, and even like change the word worship to something that repulses you less if you need to, but realize that no matter which way you try and move here and there, you're doing the thing. And I almost feel like you kind of paid an ode to like, how do you know? Like, and is this the form that you resonate with or not? I was thinking it's a bit like dating, right? Like you put out the feelers and then something calls back or doesn't, like if you're ugly, but like something will call back. And there's this whole school of thought and process in Hinduism a lot of people aren't familiar with, called Ishtadevata, which is the process by which you come into oneness with your cherished one, that the cherished God in the pantheon, one of them harkens out to you if you put out the feelers. And I don't mean to cheapen it by talking about modern dating, but there are some religions and there are some sub-religions and sects that actually have a built-in way you get to this process of realizing the source of your resonance that you can intuit, and really just materializing that, which I find amazing. And then the other thing I was going to just say is, yeah, when we talk about like false idols and stuff, I guess one way to determine whether something is real or not, worthy of your time, attention, and human currency and capital or not, is by the physiological reaction you experience in return. You mentioned the example of the phone, and obviously you can see a person senescing or senescing into decrepitude when they're scrolling all day, for example. But
Who has who has been on their phone for 2 hours, then turns it off, gets up and goes like, man, had such a great time. Like it's so rare that we can tell viscerally, like we get that feeling. And I think another good way, this is quoted from somewhere but lost the source, about like the way to tell the value of a desire is not the excitement that it broods as we are coming to it, but the feeling that we are left with its departure.
perfect. Yeah, yeah. And I think a kind of a commonly talked about concept is also instant versus delayed gratification, and that kind of bodes here really well as well. I know John Vervaeke speaks about the importance of the sensation and the physiology of the piloerection, and I wonder if that's a determinant as well, right? He calls it the one instance in human experience, or one of the very few, where the shrinkage of the self is deem to be a positive experience. You think, my God, I'm nothing, and I love that I'm nothing because the thing that I'm nothing in front of is just undeniably, irrefutably
Mm, mm,
sublime. You don't
mm,
feel that
mm.
way towards your phone. You don't think, I suck because that girl was so hot on the other side of the world and I would never get her. That's a disheartening experience, not an enlivening and profuse experience.
Yeah, and for me, like that feeling of erection, you could even call Holy Spirit. And for me, like the time which I pretty reliably have that feeling of just like shivers, not only getting shivers, but them just like moving up and down and flowing all through like your back is when I'm singing in concert at church, when I'm in choir with people. And what are we doing there? But yeah, but worshiping. And so that's also the place, yeah, really profoundly where you experience and encounter that.
Totally. And the second greatest artist of all time, I will now quote his song Follow God. This is from Kanye West. This is on the topic of false idols. He says, life like, this is what your life like, trying to live your life right. People really know you, push your buttons like type right. This is like a movie, but it's really very lifelike. Every single night, right? Every single fight, right? I was looking at the gram and I don't even like likes. I was screaming at my dad. He told me it ain't Christ-like. Crazy, eh? And yeah, so I mean, going back to Aristotle, unless you want to say something on that first.
No, speaks for itself.
It truly does. The eternal unmoved substance he's moving us towards cannot. We talked about the imperishability of the Godhead as well as Krishna explains it. Imperishability means it cannot pass from one stage to another. It means that there's a eternality to the substance, to the substantiality to the thing that you're worshiping, in that it's the same, quote unquote, every day that you get up and worship it. Like the phone kind of changes, your relationship to it changes. In fact, it actually worsens as you become more and more debilitated. The phone is the classic example. If you had to put an image to describe our zeitgeist, it would either be a phone or a condom, because it's has
Gosh,
to be one of those
yeah.
two.
And get this, right? The whole thing about some of like the higher substances as being removable in its essentiality, right? The phone and these items that when we know something is not worthy of worship, it's because it makes us codependent on it. But if something's worthy of worship, it keeps us free. It doesn't draw us in. It doesn't make us need to come back. And so with the phone, as you're saying, like if it's debilitating, if it makes you feel worse, you're going to be feeling worse. And so you go to it again to try and escape and to try and quell those feelings, or turn to alcohol again, or you turn to the gym again for some, because we feel unworthy. And so we go to a place where we can, yeah, almost try and get more out of it. But when we're worshiping something that is properly giving back to us, like it almost feels like, oh, isn't this so great? Now I'll return to it
Yes.
when it wants me,
Right.
but it doesn't want me right now. I can go
Yes.
this way.
And I, to use terminology me and you have used in discussions in the past and are very familiar with, I wonder if this is all a proxy for addiction cycles and progressive narrowing versus mutually accelerated disclosure. And it's so crack up that Aristotle, like I'm quoting him from Lambda 8 here, he says, and God also has life, for the activation of thought is a life, and he is that activation. His intrinsic activation is supreme, eternal life. Accordingly, we assert that God is a supreme and eternal living being, so that to God belong life and continuous and eternal duration, for that is what God is. So he just puts this stamp of authority saying, for that is what God is. And again, I want to just point to the valor of Aristotle here for just like coming outright and saying what he thinks. This is something I've just rummaged through thinker after thinker, waiting to find out what they actually think. And yeah, you just get it, like we discussed in the Nietzschean, when was it? I don't know, but something about the ass arrives most beautiful and brave, and you've just been working at it, and then you cross the plateau, and there it is.
There it is, standing as God, the great activator, the reciprocal opening that affords. God is as affordances, and this affordances is it gives you yourself. Like it opens you up to more and more. How in a intimate relationship it's about finding yourself in the other, and that can be very meaningful. Yeah, Aristotle's unmoved mover is about like finding more to life, not only finding yourself, but also finding life in this principle. This has been a colossal episode. This has been amazing. And I found another piece of humor in Aristotle. So as we wrap up, wanting to sound this out too, and it's actually from Lambda 10, the last chapter in this book. And I see it as him taking a dig at Pythagoras in a very hilarious way, where he's speaking to, some of the other people that have this sense of an unmoved mover, or who have spoken in this term before. And he says, quote, "And those who say mathematical number is first and go on to generate one kind of substance after another and give different principles for each, make the substance of this universe a mere series of episodes. And they give us many governing principles, but the world refuses to be governed badly."
You, with that quote, you said, try this on for size, and here I am saying it fits. Nice. Yeah, he kind of leans into this idea a bit at the close of the Lambdas, and also to close this episode as well. I guess the tone and the intonation of Aristotle here is one of sympathy for the natural laws that pervade life in the universe. And he says, here are some that aren't the case. And then he names those, for example, Pythagoras there. And he also turns spokesperson and lawyer for the universe, saying, I'll take it from here. There are things that are natural laws. And I think my takeaway from the close of the entire Lambdas was that for him, goodness is one of them. We know he speaks at length as to what that actually means in relation to the true and the beautiful and the Nicomachean ethics. But here he just simply says goodness carries or travels. And then I was also reminded of one of my favorite ever maxims or proverbs, if you want to call it that, which is happiness doubles when you share it and grief halves when you share it. So there's like an inequity baked into the ultimacy and existential nature of the universe itself, like almost experience and observer independent.
Yeah, that's immense. That's immense. I particularly like the way that he finishes this whole chapter, because he finishes it by quoting Odysseus in the Iliad, which is great and brings it together. And we've got the Odyssey being released quite soon. This new epic movie where the father figure is coming back to Hollywood finally, and he quotes Odysseus, who's summoning courage and unity among the Greek troops who are at Troy and have been fighting for years, and are starting to get a bit fragmented, and you've got different leaders who are commanding different factions, and then one will say one thing, and okay, we need to, we should be looking to retreat, and then like half of the troops are looking to get back into the boats. And Odysseus stands up and says, "A multitude of rulers is not a good thing. Let there be one ruler, one king." And it's even, psychoanalyzing Odysseus is to psychoanalyze Homer and to find the self as always being there from the start. You can trace out these myths that do have recurrent patterns, that do have an ontological depth, a metaphysical zest. And it all seems quite fitting to me that Aristotle is on this chapter putting himself in relation to the mythological substrate that thought comes from, that psyche comes from. And finishing on that with a bit of a mic drop, I think is also just puts him in this zone of pathos, right, where it's a little bit like, this is leadership.
Totally. I think that's also just such a nice encapsulation of late stage civilizational collapse and fracture, and how that necessarily happens when the one splits into the many sometimes. There's a way or a manner in which that always happens. It's just very different, the style in which that happens. But it's also worth saying that to the naysaying self-proclaimed atheists, Aristotle's God is not a creator of stuff. It's not like saying this pen exists on this table because God created it somehow. Well, the person at Office Max created the pen, but then that guy did Office Max, and then all the way, it's not a causal chain all the way up to God. Aristotle's God is a creator of process itself. It's almost like the eternal return of difference. It eludes our grasp because he's not creating things. But I really loved your quote of Odysseus. I think it's a tremendous note to end on. And this has been a monumental episode. I have a few closing thoughts. Anything on your end, though?
No, it's colossal. It is colossal. I'm looking forward to perhaps in the next episode, yeah, seeing what balancing we can provide to this perspective, or yeah, seeing how this sits and percolates within our psyche, what is called forth from us in response, whether yeah, just how we feel like this episode sits. I'm curious about that, and yeah, even addressing it and maybe leaning more into this metaphysical bidirectionality, which would be very fascinating way forward. But I have, yeah, thoroughly enjoyed this episode, and yeah, just God is good.
God is good. Amen.